I am a Stormtrooper. My skin is my armor. My face is my helmet. My name is my number. I am fulfilled, for I am an agent of the Emperor. We, the Stormtroopers, are always attack first and do not stop until we reach our target. We operate on every planet in the Empire, and thus White Helmet is the face of the Imperial Armed Forces. Stormtrooper TX 5532. This story is dedicated to the armored clothing of the clones of the Grand Army of the Republic and Stormtroopers of the Galactic Empire, around which there are already so many jokes and assumptions. I think many of you will be particularly interested in the answer to the question, what can clone and Stormtrooper armor protect against? And can they protect against anything at all? Stormtroopers and clones, along with lightsabers, Jedi, Death Star and Star Destroyers, are the symbol of the incredibly rich fictional Star Wars universe, just like how a green power armored comrade is a symbol of the Halo universe. Or how genetically modified space troopers in power armor are inseparable from the image of the dystopian world of the Eternal War, Warhammer 40,000. The clones and stormtroopers of the far, far galaxy also wore power armor, but rarely. Their standard armor is quite an interesting topic. According to polls, Stormtrooper armor is the most recognizable, most famous armor in sci-fi movies. If you see white armor and a distinctive helmet, it's immediately clear. You're looking at a Star Wars Stormtrooper. As you remember, the Kaminoans, who fulfilled the secret order of the then quite charismatic Sith, comfortably seated in the Supreme Chancellor's chair, promised to produce a full-fledged army in large numbers, not just millions of soldiers. And that meant that the soldiers had to be not only trained but also clothed. It was necessary to give them in their hands some weapons, put them in an armored and flying or riding coffin in a combat vehicle. Most of the vehicles and weapons and equipment were ordered from outside companies. Acclimator 1 class assault ships, ATTE or all-terrain tactical enforcer pedometers, and other flying and riding instruments of war were made for them by craftsmen from Quat Drive Yards Corporation. Droids for the Army, such as the battlefield medical IM-6 droids, were produced by Cibot Galactica and Industrial Automaton. It would seem that with such a reasonable approach, it would be worth ordering armor from some company that knows how to do it. It seems reasonable to order armor from a company that specializes in it. The galaxy had a huge selection, but they wanted to do it themselves. Kaminoan weaponsmiths. This was the typical name of Kaminoan's own company producing personal protective equipment. Everyone involved in the topic knew about Kaminoans, that they are great clone creators, but their armor was somehow unheard of. Though it is understandable, because before the army of clones, Kaminoans mostly grew genetically modified slaves, almost servitors, and made equipment for mines and harmful industries. Kaminoan weaponsmiths made spacesuits, masks, and so on. Sometimes they raised elite bodyguards and guardsmen for some minor rulers. For them, they also made high-quality armor and special electronics, and grew slave girls for elite brothels. That is, earlier Kaminoans made either special working protective equipment, in which nobody would ever think of fighting, or made very cool combat equipment, but in very small runs for special persons. Having taken on the task of producing armor for a multi-million-dollar army, the clone makers faced unexpected problems. For the elite, the armor could and should have been stuffed with high tech, from heel to toe and made impenetrable by blaster cannons. And here it was necessary to stamp hundreds of millions of relatively inexpensive, easy to produce, but at the same time high-quality sets of armor. And this task is not an easy one. Their first attempt failed, as the saying goes. Who would have doubted it? The clone armor of the Phase 1 trooper was based on Jango Fett's designs. Yes, this Mandalorian's skills were not limited to highly artistic shooting at enemies and carving enemies' bodies with a knife. He could also draw. Jango had a lot of input on the design of the helmet and its internal stuffing. Other Mandalorians hired by Jango also gave some advice. Jango was undoubtedly a great one-man fighter. He had managed to fight a bit in a mercenary gang early in his career, but with all my respect for the character, he had little idea of what a regular soldier needed on a regular battlefield, especially a battle that uses artillery, armored vehicles, and aviation. If the Kaminoans had only listened to the Mandalorian's advice, there was no telling what they would have gotten out of it. But the Kaminoans ignored most of the advices of the former Mandalorian, deciding to act on their own. The material chosen for the clone armor in the first phase of the Kaminoans was a cheap, easy to manufacture and process, and relatively light polymer. The Mandalorians, and especially Jango, and other invited mercenaries insisted on more expensive and more durable materials, duraplastic and durasteel. Durasteel, by the way, was used to make the armor of Jango himself, and most of the invited Mandalorians. A small but very important remark. In the new canon, Jango and Boba's armor is forged from Beskar, the trademark Mandalorian iron, while earlier, in the original Star Wars, including in the sources of the highest category to the creation of which Grandpa Lucas personally had a hand in, their armor was made of durasteel, since at that time Beskar was very rare and therefore extremely expensive. Expensive even for highly paid mercenaries Jango and Bob. Only many years later, during the Second Galactic Civil War, Boba and Fett will replace their armor with Beskar-free armor. But then Beskar would also become cheaper because of the discovery of new Beskar's sources. Then even some fighter jets will be made of Beskar. Durasteel was also used to make most part of Darth Vader's spacesuit. It was a serious material. The second material recommended by the Mandalorians was duraplastic. It too was noticeably stronger than polymer, but noticeably more expensive to process. The Mandalorians often made their armor from this alloy as well. In the opinion of the Kaminoans, it was not suitable for mass-produced infantry armor. It was eventually used only for special forces armor. However, you should not think that plastoid polymer is such plastic nonsense that can be punctured with a finger. Plastoid is not a bad material either, but in my opinion, you shouldn't skimp on the clones' equipment. After all, clones are very expensive soldiers, much more expensive than droids, and they take a long time to grow. But the Kaminoans thought in their own way. Plastoid has one undoubted advantage. Armor made of this material allows clone soldiers to pass through dangerous energy fields, including deflector shields. The only part made by the Kaminoans that wasn't changed in the end was the lining what the armor plates were mounted on. Hello from the Middle Ages. In case those who don't know, gambeson was worn under lats and ringlets in the Middle Ages. The lining of the clone was a tight jumpsuit of black color made of unknown material. Unlike real armor designed to absorb the kinetic energy of stabbing, chopping iron flying into your body, the Stormtrooper's jumpsuit was also an additional layer of protection from shrapnel, high and low temperatures, and allowed to regulate body temperature, being the most important element in the climate control system of the armored suit. That is, you wouldn't freeze in it at minus 300 degrees, at least not immediately, and at plus 400 degrees you wouldn't swelter from the heat. Ahsoka Tano's light spacesuit from the animated series Clone Wars was made of this material, only thicker. The Stormtrooper's armor later had a full-fledged climate control system. Its unit was located on the backside of the sheet covering the abdomen, and the control buttons were on the outside. The number and location of buttons could differ on armor of different series. During their training at the Academy, Stormtroopers were forbidden to touch them or to regulate the temperature inside their armor in any way. It was believed that cadets had to learn all the hardships of military service. When injured, the jumpsuit acted as a compression bandage, tightening the wound. There's a common misconception. It is thought that the blaster shot cauterizes the wound, and therefore there is no bleeding. In fact, if the wound is lacerated, hits an artery, or the blaster discharge plunges deep into the body, creating a long and extensive wound channel, bleeding is inevitable. The blaster in Star Wars is not a laser weapon, but a plasma weapon. The suit was made of a smart material that adapted to the wearer's body heat, and ambient temperature, becoming like a second skin. The clone infantryman's armor consists of 20 elements, 20 armor plates that are mounted on the jumpsuit. How they were mounted on him was a big question. No fasteners, snaps, or ties were visible on the suits. Most likely, in a galaxy far away, soldiers dressed similarly, like movie actors and cosplayers. First, they put on leg armor. The greaves were fastened to the belt with a snap button. Then the armor on the belly, the cuirass, was mounted on a system resembling suspenders. The cuirass was put on in the same way as real cuirasses, with the cuffs attached to it. This was how both clones of the Grand Army of the Republic and Imperial Stormtroopers dressed. An experienced soldier could put on his stylish armor suit in less than a minute without assistance. This method of attaching armor elements was intended to make the armor easier to wear, by distributing the weight over the entire body. The main disadvantage of Phase 1 armor was its sheer weight. The Kaminoans began to make armor out of an albeit durable but too heavy grade of postoid, which made a full set of clone gear weigh 40 kilograms. The clones didn't complain because they just didn't see any other options. Late medieval battle armor, for example, weighed no more than 30 kilograms, and often about 27 kilograms. Of course, there were in the late Middle Ages armor weighing more than 30 kilograms, but it was tournament, not combat armor. And clones had armor weighing 40 kilograms, and clones had to actively run, climb, jump, and shoot in it. Before the Clone Wars began, the issue of weight didn't seem to be of much interest to their creators. But as soon as it came to combat, even the clones began to resent it. First of all, those who saw the clone commandos, who, despite the more massive-looking armor, weighed considerably less. But as the saying goes, the sheriff doesn't care about the Indians' problems. Although in this case, the farmer doesn't care about the apples. To the Kaminoans, the clones they produced were apples, just a commodity. You wouldn't pay attention to the discomfort of apples in a crate, would you? In addition to weight, the clones were also embarrassed by the discomfort of the armor. Standing and walking were possible, but with such weight, you sometimes wanted to sit down. But sitting in this armor was very uncomfortable, especially for the crews of armored vehicles, locked inside a tank or a pedomobile for several hours. The explanation for this blunder is that the Kaminoans were excellent at growing clones, but not at human anatomy. They did not understand what would happen when a human ran around the battlefield with a blaster in his hands. Considering the shortcomings of the armor, from the very first days the troops received complaints from the officers commanding the troops, from the Jedi, and in general from everyone, including some clones with their broken patience. Under the shouts from the front, the Kaminoans began to think about how to improve the life of the common soldier. But not because of humanity, which they lacked, but because they wanted the customer to be satisfied. As you know, the customer is always right, and as a result, they came up with a new version of armor, calling their new creation Armor Phase 2. Besides the fact that this armor saved millions of cloned lives, the clones liked the helmet's stuffing, ironically named Bucket or White Bucket. The helmet had a targeting system integrated with all of the Grand Army's standard weapons, from pistols to stationary blasters. The DS-15, a blaster rifle, was the primary weapon. It was a very accurate, long-range and very powerful weapon that weighed only 4.5 kilograms. By the way, this rifle cost 2,200 credits, while the entire armor set of the first phase only cost 2,000 credits. The price of clone armor for a long time did not appear in the official sources, which caused a lot of controversy in the fan community. The price tag finally appeared only in the Rise of the Separatists guide on May 9, 2019. The rifle's excessive power, high cost and size soon necessitated its replacement. And by the end of the Clone Wars, the VC-15C carbine, which cost only 1,000 credits, became the main firearm. An electro-optical sight was integrated into the helmet's sighting system. It projected a reticle onto the helmet's visor. The reticle looked like a crosshair in computer games. This made it possible, after some practice, to fire from the hip or from cover, which was quite convenient. Also inside the helmet was a complex network of sensors that filtered the incoming image, making it easier to detect even well-camouflaged targets in open areas and behind cover. The thermal imager helped in difficult cases, although apparently not all helmets had thermal imaging cameras. But what is known for sure is that early helmets did not have night vision devices, which could have led to this funny situation. The lack of night vision forced the clones to use flashlights attached to their helmets or lights on their rifles, or an external night vision device. The same device also worked as binoculars. The four-fold zoom of the helmet optics was not sufficient in some situations. If the target could not be seen, it could be detected by ear. The helmet's external microphones, when used properly, filtered high and low frequency sounds well. Although the main purpose of the external microphones and the noise reduction system was different, it was designed to keep a soldier from going deaf when an artillery shell exploded nearby or someone nearby fired something loud. In normal settings, the helmet earpiece suppressed loud sounds and amplified quiet ones. which made it possible to hear a soft command from the commander during a fierce firefight, or to muffle his three-story mat in front of a line of soldiers and stand quietly with a satisfied face, smiling stupidly. You can't see your face in your helmet anyway. Such headphones exist. If you do not know, for example, in the night forest, you can hear human speech at a distance of up to 200 meters with real active headphones, and from 100 meters even make out what they are talking about. In addition to active ears, sensors, gauges, and other thermal imagers in the helmet was a built-in comlink short-range signal encryption system. However, the separatists often intercepted and blocked the clone's communication system. They could also figure out the source of the signal by sending the chatty soldier a rocket bomb explosive gift or a squad of droids to have a heart-to-heart talk. That's why, if a squad was behind enemy lines, clones rarely used comlinks or even turned them off. The commanders gave orders by voice and gestures. The comlink antenna was stuffed into the crest of the helmet. By the way, Lucas was inspired by the images of ancient Greek and Roman warriors, and it was such an order issued to artists drawing sketches of concept art for the second episode. And the crest on the helmet, in Western popular culture, is firmly associated precisely with ancient helmets, so it was simply impossible to do without it. The last thing the clones liked was that the helmet allowed them to see well in the fog, through fire, dust, and other effects that prevented them from seeing the enemy. The processor and programs built into the helmet easily filtered out such interference. In the case of clones and later stormtroopers, the phrase "no smoke without fire" should be rephrased. There is fire, but you can't see the smoke. Remember that moment from Episode 2 when the fallen separatist Colobus ship kicked up a pile of dust and sand into the air? The droids were blinded at that moment, but the clones saw their targets perfectly and were firing accurately. Oh, by the way, the seeing part. Many questions arise about the narrow slit of the helmet, how it was possible to see through it. Helmet visor is not a simple glass, but a whole camera, which delivered to the clone already processed image and displayed it on the display, which was called HUD. This device was designed to display symbolic and graphic information on the windshield. Initially, they were created for military aviation, primarily fighter and attack aircraft. The information displayed right in front of the pilot's nose allowed not to be distracted by the instruments during maneuvering combat, and thus not to lose sight of the target. Later, they began to be used in civil aviation, and now they are even put on civilian cars. A fighter could not see with his own eyes. If the enemy used a weapon with an electromagnetic pulse that disabled the electronics, the soldier could go blind or deaf. There was a moment in one of the Republic comic book series where a clone caught a shot to the head. The soldier thought he was blinded at first, but in reality the plasma simply burned out the helmet's chambers and he stopped seeing. The settings of all helmet systems can be twisted and turned without removing it from your head. In all types of clone helmets, this was done with a glance. For example, you looked in the upper left corner, blinked twice, a menu popped up, selected the desired item, blinked again, another menu popped up. Batteries, explosive grenades, and gas canisters for the blaster were placed on the belt. During the war, the clones became short on ammunition, so they began to take extra batteries and extra gas canisters, hanging them on the belt like a cartridge case. One gas cylinder was enough for 500 shots on medium power or 300 shots on maximum power for DC-15A rifle and DC-15C carbine, but the battery, aka energy cell, had to be replaced every 50 or 30 shots if you turned the power to maximum. At the start of the war, a clone was supposed to carry 2 detonators. Their detonators are essentially 2 fragmentation grenades and 1 emigrant that strikes with an electromagnetic pulse. The grenades were also placed on the belt on the side of the back or hung on cartridges. But the first battles showed the low effectiveness of conventional fragmentation grenades against droids, so basically everyone began to use emigranates and thermal detonators. In addition, it was necessary to carry an individual dressing bag containing foam or gel to disinfect and cover wounds, plasters, and simple bandages. It was usually enough to stop the bleeding or give first aid for a blaster wound. The clones understood the importance of medical and field kit, but didn't always carry it with them, preferring to have a corpsman carry it all. In the third episode, during the Battle of Utapor, a soldier bent over a wounded comrade and called out to someone outside the frame. He called for a corpsman, as he himself had nothing to help his fellow soldier. If it was supposed to shoot, run, and fight long and hard behind enemy lines, then a small standard army backpack could easily hold energy cells and cylinders with blaster gas for tens of thousands of shots. Additional grenades, first aid kit, dry rations, and other tasty and useful things could also be shoved in there. If you don't count the excessive weight of the armor, it's also part of the answer to the question, why are bullet weapons, including firearms, so rarely used in a galaxy far, far away? Just imagine, how much would 5 kilograms of ammunition weigh? What the armor of the clones of the first phase didn't have, but should have added, were beacons and sensors of the fighter's condition, so that it would be possible to find a wounded soldier faster among the mountains of corpses, damaged droids, and ruins of buildings. After all, in field medicine there is a concept of golden hour. The sooner a wounded soldier gets into the caring hands of an orderly, and from them to the operating table of a medical droid, the better his chances of survival. And clones are too valuable a resource to throw away. As we know, sometimes clones just get lost, filling up missing persons lists. In the comic book series, there's a lost clone called BL 1707 named Ablon. He was the sole survivor and of his squad, surviving the fall of the Watt and subsequent droid attacks. But communication was lost and he found no friendly units. The entire squad was put on the list of irrecoverable losses, but this clone survived and spent the next 2 decades living Robinson Crusoe style on the planet. Another thing the clone armor lacked was a unified information network for better coordination between units of different troops. The rudiments of this system were there, but it will finally appear much later. Another common question, why didn't the clones use camouflage and run around the battlefield in milky white armor? They did, but very rarely. In the early days of the war, it was forbidden by regulations. It was forbidden because of the Kaminoans. They had their own ideas of beauty. They considered white to be a sign of purity, holiness, and perfection, and they considered their wares to be perfect. To distinguish officers from enlisted men, a system of rapid color identification was introduced. The snipers give us a standing ovation. In the clone armor of the first phase, there was no way to display the name, surname, personal number, and rank of the person standing in front of you. So we had to use a primitive system like this. Soldiers with green marks were sergeants, blue, lieutenants, red, captains, yellow, commanders. It's not hard to guess why this system didn't last long. Unique emblems and colors of regiments and legions took their place. Often they were adjacent to personal drawings on the armor, the authorship of the clones themselves. In the second episode, there was a phrase, "Clones can think creatively." So they decided to think creatively. In terms of the universe, this is so that the viewer can visually distinguish one clone from another. And the longer the war went on, the more unique painting appeared on the clone's armor. Curiously, the Kaminoans were initially concerned about the degree of individuality displayed by the clones. The Kaminoans believed that this could cause the clones to become less disciplined, and thus less able to follow orders and not do what they were bred to do. The Jedi, on the other hand, encouraged their subordinates to be creative, as it allowed the clones to be unique individuals rather than the bio-robots that the Kaminoans believed them to be. It was believed that such a clone would be a better fighter. However, there were some Jedi who saw clones as mere meat droids, good only for warfare. The famous Pong Krell was not the only Jedi who did not see clones as human. It was the Jedi who encouraged the clones to take on nicknames that replaced their names, get tattoos, and customize their armor. I now know them as individuals, and I can't change that. Now neither clone soldiers nor commanders or even ARC clones will be faceless units to me anymore. I will always want to know who is behind that visor. How can I be a Jedi and not recognize them as living beings with all that entails? These are the words of Jedi and future Mandalorian Barden Jusik. These were also the thoughts of Senator Dance Kino of the planet Chandril. We have laws about how we should treat sentient beings. We have laws about how we should treat animals and semi-sentient beings. We even have laws protecting plants, but we have absolutely no laws showing any concern for artificially created soldiers for human beings. They have no legal status, no rights, no freedoms, no representation. Every one of you here should lower your head in shame. And in the novel Order 66, Jedi Master Ruka explained to Mace Windu why he decided not to be a general of the Grand Army anymore. As a Jedi, I was trained to protect life. I led these clones, know these people to their deaths. They were living, thinking beings. What I am being asked to do is the exact opposite of everything I was taught as a Jedi. In addition to the individual daubs on the armor, there were colorings of entire units. Sometimes the coloration of armor in units could change. For example, the 41st Legion of Jedi Master Luminar Unduli originally had a green color scheme. I think you can see why. Green wristbands, green loincloths, and green stripes on their helmets. And at the end of the war, part of the 41st Legion flaunted white armor with gray stripes and gray shoulder pads. You may have seen these comrades in the animated series The Clone Wars. At the same time, part of the Legion wore protective armor and actively used camouflage colors. For example, the clone commander of SS-1004, nicknamed Green, actually Luminar Unduli's deputy, wore black, gray-green armor during the Battle of Koshiik. Clones from AAF, Advanced Second Force Reconnaissance and Sabotage units, often repainted their armor to match the color of the terrain. This also applied to almost all clones of scouting units of future Scout Stormtroopers and some clones from regular line units. Still, it is worth recognizing that camouflage was not a common practice, neither in the Grand Army of the Republic, much less later during the period of the Galactic Empire. Only some specializations of stormtroopers were allowed to paint their armor a color other than white. Another disadvantage of the armor of the first phase was the lack of modular architecture. That is, the armor was difficult to modify and the list of additional devices was very limited. Apart from the aforementioned night vision device or binoculars, the clone could only add a jetpack, a rocket pack. Notably, created at the same time as the armor of the first phase, the ARC clone armor was easily modifiable. It could be fitted with anything you wanted, even a can opener. Later, this modularity would carry over to the Phase 2 armor, and then to the Stormtrooper armor. The acronym AIC stands for Advanced Icon Commandos. These were special kind of clones. They were bred for special operations deep inside enemy territories. Often such tasks were beyond the capabilities of ordinary clones. Ordinary clones rarely showed personal initiative except for officer clones, and often because of this they were inferior to ordinary humans in terms of intelligence, making ordinary clones ill-suited for ordinary life. They simply didn't understand the thought process of civilians, which meant that an ordinary clone was a poor scout or saboteur. By breeding our clones, the Kaminoans decided to remedy this by eliminating the suppression of initiative. They also added intelligence to them, some so that they had eidetic memory. This phenomenon is often called photographic memory in the real world. Jango Fett never dreamed of such an ability to memorize and reproduce huge amounts of information. Some Arclonians, even without any neuroprogramming, managed to learn the language of any other race in a week. No wonder why many of them decided not to follow Order 66 afterwards. On top of that, the ARC clones were stronger and faster than normal clones. ARC troopers could operate alone or in small units of up to 10 men. During the war, they carried out thousands of special operations, causing huge damage to the infrastructure of the Confederacy of Independent Systems. In particular, by sabotaging 49 CIS production facilities and capturing and interrogating separatist engineers, ARC troopers Null 5 or N5, later named Prudi Skirata, managed to influence the addition of 5% cavanium to the alloy, and to do it in such a way that this defect was not noticed by the factory's quality control automation. This caused some series of B1 and B2 droids to become very brittle. Diversion increased the ratio of clone to droid losses from 1 to 20 to 1 to 50. However, 1 clone per 50 droids was also lost due to the clones gaining combat experience and better equipment. Acklon equipment was also made of protoid, but the polymer used for it was stronger and lighter. As a result, the strength characteristics were preserved, but the weight of the armor was reduced by more than 2 times. Let me remind you that the weight of the armor of the first phase was 40 kilograms, and the armor of the ARC clones began to weigh less than 20 kilograms. And the armor also became more comfortable, more ergonomic, and allowed mounting additional modules. It was often supplemented with a massive shoulder pad on the left shoulder, increasing the survivability of the fighter. In addition, the protection of the thighs was strengthened. A half-skirt, kama, was not superfluous. It protected the fighter's ass from the exhaust of the rocket pack and at the same time was a good anti-skid protection. Tip: never call a Karma a skirt. Clones react very badly to it. The Grand Army commanders borrowed the idea of the Karma from their Mandalorian mentors. Many were convinced that wearing a Karma was a Mandalorian tradition. But not really. The Mandalorians themselves had honestly borrowed the Karma from the Tirsus Sun Guard, with whom the Mandalorians had been competing in the mercenary military market for hundreds of years. Another difference in arch armor was a more powerful helmet-mounted comlink, with an improved dynamic signal encryption system. Some clones also have glove-mounted tasers like those used by the police to disarm unlawfully violent citizens when they don't want to shoot them on sight. The taser fires 2 electrodes that, once in the body, can cause a muscle spasm and completely immobilize the target. For example, the taser was in the ARC 77, nicknamed Fordo. In the armor of the ARCs, there was still sometimes a hologram projector built into the wristband. You could project the full-length face of a senior officer or show yourself and others a 3-dimensional map of the terrain to plan how to defeat the enemy. Or here was another useful gadget. Rex, who wore our clone armor, had room in his helmet for a built-in mine detector. He used it during the battle for Umbara. The armor would have been the best, if not for the price. There was always a price to pay for high quality. Our clone armor was 3 times more expensive than Phase 1 clone armor. 6,000 far, far away galactic bucks versus 2,000 for simple Phase 1 armor. The Senate of the Galactic Republic said, "Nah, not too expensive, give us one just like it, but cheaper." The Kaminoans began to develop armor for simple infantry based on the armor of the first phase Arclons. At the same time, they were looking for ways to improve the armor of the Arclons themselves. Phase 2. Clone armor was created and tested in just a couple of months. Mass production began at the beginning of the next year of the Clone Wars. But in the first phase, so many sets of armor were created that in some units the armor of the first phase was delayed until the middle of the war. This was primarily true of the rear of the army, such as the Coruscant Guard. These hardly fought at all, chased teas, and in the breaks dreamed of police service in the capital. They dispersed illegal anti-war rallies with electroshock democratizers, fought organized crime, caught spies and terrorists. And in terms of combat training, they were the weakest of all the soldiers of the Grand Army. The Coruscant Guard, even in the 20th year of Yavin, that is only a year before the end of the war, was still running around in Phase 1 armor. It was only a few months before the final salvos of the war that they were changed into Phase 2 armor. The armor of one platoon was connected by a single information network, which allowed the unit commander to always know the location and status of his subordinates. In addition, they had a navigation system that allowed them to navigate freely in the confusing labyrinths of Coruscant's lower-level slums, where one could get lost even with a guidebook and a local guide. During rearmament, there were clones who refused to change into new armor on principle. That's why you could occasionally meet a cuirass of the second phase with a helmet of the first phase, and vice versa. But most units of the Grand Army changed into the second phase already in the 21st year before Yavin. Due to the fact that the warehouses on Kamino were filled to the top with armor of the first phase, few people counted this armor during the rearmament process. The Kaminoans looked, counted, and using their wits took the government's goods into circulation. Thanks in part to them, it was possible to find brand new and slightly worn clone armor of the first phase at a good price on the black market of the galaxy, although they were not very popular because of their heavy weight. The Kaminoans were well aware that the winds of galactic politics were very fickle. If the High Chancellor continued to rule, the Republic might have some claim on the Kaminoans' possessions. Having no army of their own, they began secretly breeding Jango Fett clones for themselves, dressing them in unaccounted for and secretly decommissioned armor. The Kaminoans were not wrong. After the Clone Wars, the Empire treated their production facilities as their own. It almost came to nationalization. The Kaminoans tried to resist and resent it 7 years after the Clone Wars, in the 12th year before Yavin. And this event was then simply called the Kaminoan Rebellion. All the clones of the Kaminoan army, dressed in outdated armor, were destroyed without much trouble. Clones fighting clones. How ironic. It was after these events that Palpatine finally decided to do what his advisors had long wished and whispered in his ear: allow ordinary people to join the Assault Corps. At the same time that ordinary people were being recruited, the factories continued to grow clones based on genetic templates. Immediately after the end of the Clone Wars, the Imperials not only did not cut back but expanded the cloning program, adding new genetic templates. All donors were volunteers, and some, like the legendary Ash-Shihablin, who despised clones, refused such an honor. As a result, less than 30% of the clones remained in the Assault Corps until the Battle of Yavin. And by the time of the Battle of Endor, the percentage of clones among the Stormtroopers had dropped even further. So what was new about the improved armor of Phase 2? First and foremost, of course, was the weight. The armor began to weigh less than 20 kilograms. In early sources, there was a figure of 16 kilograms. For a soldier, this is very important. The lighter the equipment, the easier it is to move, the less tired you get. At the same time, the armor of the second phase has become better in terms of protection. For example, the cuirass has become thicker. All the electronic systems of the first phase have been retained, and new ones have been added. There were lenses with automatic polarization, which meant that the fighter was not blinded by bright lights. Explosions did not have to blink at the sight of flashes of blaster discharges, including their own, and could safely look at the nuclear explosion. Improved air filters and oxygen systems were installed. This was why the Separatists had so rarely used chemical weapons against clones throughout the war, and the most important advantage was modularity. Based on the armor of the second phase, they created a whole line of specialized armor suits adapted for clones of different specializations. Basically, the helmet and some internal elements were changed. For example, in the third episode, the armor suit differed by another type of helmet, adapted for driving at high speed. All other changes were internal, being hidden under the armor. By the end of the Clone Wars, several dozen author modifications to the Phase 2 armor had been collected. One of the disadvantages of the armor of the first phase was the inability to operate normally in space. It was possible to go into open space, but not for more than a few minutes. Regarding the armor of the second phase, early sources said that it was possible to fight in open space in it, just like the Imperial Stormtrooper armor. That is, it's completely airtight, there are no internal pressure issues, and the oxygen supply lasts for 30 minutes. Then this statement was refuted by one of the episodes of the animated series, The Clone Wars. There, clones hastily connect additional breathing apparatuses to helmet filters in case of depressurization of the shuttle. Stormtroopers sometimes did that too, but only when they had to stay for a long time in open space or in the conditions of aggressive environment where there was nothing to breathe, or one breath was enough to go to a hospital bed for a long time. Although perhaps the clones in the animated series decided to simply reinsure themselves by wearing breathing apparatuses in advance. By the way, airtightness and automatic regulation of the internal pressure of the armor gave soldiers the opportunity to land at high overloads and from high altitudes. Clone infantrymen rarely landed in landing pods, for a mistake was expensive for the Republic's budget. But their Imperial successors, the Stormtroopers, used landing pods much more often. And they could land both in small capsules designed for 4 to 10 people and in large capsules being already in the cabin of armored vehicles. The armor of the second phase became more expensive. 3,000 credits against 2,000 for the first phase. Arklon armor cost 6,000 credits. I said above that the Kaminoans were thinking about how to improve the already good armor of the Special Forces, the armor of the Arklons of the first phase. A year after the war started, the second phase armor for the Arklons came into production. The electronic stuffing of the new armor of the second phase Arklon armor remained the same. The armor was strengthened by adding another armor plate to the cuirass and reinforced greaves. But most importantly, the price of the armor was reduced from 6,000 to 5,000 credits. Always a part of the Grand Army, and later the Empire, were the snowtroopers, and the battle swimmers, Sith troopers. It was markedly different from what was later issued to the Imperial conquerors of the deep for wear. Since the Kaminoans are an aquatic race themselves, they know perfectly well how to operate. how to fight in deep water lakes, seas, and oceans. They didn't even need to build special training grounds for combat swimmers. They have the whole planet. One continuous training ground. Special armor, special equipment, and appropriate weapons were developed for divers. After all, not every blaster will want to shoot underwater. Plasma doesn't do well in water at all. The combat swimmers were mostly armed with DC-12 ray guns, developed by the same corporation, Blastech Industries. The Kaminoans were surprisingly very responsible about equipping the combat swimmers. Several variants of underwater armor were produced before and during the Clone Wars, and all variants can be considered successful. All modifications were equally light and flexible, but at the same time, the level of protection was almost as good as infantry armor, allowing them to withstand the pressure at great depths. Helmets of combat swimmers had powerful cameras and lenses that allowed them to see even in very murky water and distinguish targets at great depths or on the background of the bottom. And if the sensors were insufficient or failed, powerful lights were mounted on the helmets and blasters. Even sonar was built into the armor and helmet, picking up the slightest sound waves at a great distance. The swimmers also had an appropriate ultrasonic underwater communication system in addition to the usual comlink. Behind the combat swimmer's back was a tank with a dozen hours supply of oxygen. The tank itself could extract oxygen from the water, recharging the battery itself. It was combined with a water cannon that accelerated movement underwater. By the way, the flippers did not need to be removed when you go ashore. It was enough to give a command in the helmet, and the fins came off by themselves. Diving equipment was developed only for combat swimmers, but sometimes it was used by special forces, specifically the ARC clones. For example, Delta Squad members used combat swimmers equipment during an operation on the resort planet Daruma. But they didn't go there to relax. They went there to catch Kaminoan scientist Kosai. The Kaminoans did their best to create the equipment for the combat divers. They did it for themselves. But alas, all this splendor cost a lot of money, although the exact figure is not reported to us. But it is known that the set of a cheerful diver cost much more expensive than the armor of a clone infantryman. Apparently, for this reason, the combat swimmers of the Galactic Empire dived in simpler equipment. The armor of the Imperial divers was a deep modification of the equipment of ordinary Imperial scouts. They wore the most ordinary rebreather, without oxygen generation system, comlink, without sophisticated communication systems, and not so high-tech set of sensors and sensors. But still the gear was decent and most importantly cheap. Only many years later, in the revived Galactic Empire of the Fel dynasty, they again thought not just about special but about high-quality equipment for combat swimmers. This is what it looked like during the Second Imperial Civil War of 138 after Yavin. A subspecies of combat swimmers were the so-called Stormtroopers, and this was not just a set of special protective equipment for ordinary combat swimmers, but also a rare specialization of Stormtroopers called to fight where no one in their right mind and good memory would go. Jungles with quagmires filled with all manner of poisonous critters and biting plants, toxic swamps, acidic industrial reservoirs, sewers. If you think you have a bad job, think about where swamp Stormtroopers fought. Accordingly, their combat equipment was good. They could shoot and hide as well as anyone. Their armor was stronger than that of regular Stormtroopers, and their helmets had more powerful filters. Another interesting thing was the choice of weapons. Swampers preferred weapons that fired bullets, needles, and burst projectiles with jet engines, that is, analogues of bow truckles. But if the places were not too poisonous, Swampers were happy to wear the armor of combat swimmers or scout Stormtroopers because of their lightness. Most of the Empire's enemies didn't even know the Bogmen existed. They were a rarity. Not even Kyle Katarn, whom they had nearly killed among the Javan swamps during the Empire's attack on the Jedi Temple, knew. But it was not only infantry who fought, but also pilots, mech drivers, field gunners, and gunners with ship guns. They were issued reinforced armor of the first phase with additional chest and shoulder protection. They have mostly sedentary jobs, so the increased weight of the armor did not embarrass them much, even pleased them. They were stuck in an open turret, protected only by faith in higher powers and democracy, that is, by nothing. One more armor plate on their belly and shoulders would not be superfluous to them. The situation with clone pilots was simpler. Kaminoans, not wisely, slyly gave them, at the beginning of the war, slightly modified sets of armor of the first phase, where the LSS, life support system was improved, allowing them to survive in a depressurized cabin or during ejection in space. And they added a remote control on the chest to control it all. Then they came to their senses and created several special models of flight helmets for pilots. And for pilots of long-range fighter bombers, there was their own set of equipment. It cost extra money, but since it was necessary, the Senate, with a heavy heart, allocated another pinch of people's money. It is also worth telling about the armor of Commando's clones. Basically, the Commando's clones wore a Katarn-type armor suit. The name has nothing to do with Kyle Katarn, an atypical Jedi, a destroyer who has caused a lot of Imperial bloodshed, a highly notable and mega-popular character. The Katarn is a very dangerous and large predatory four-legged reptile native to the planet Kashyyyk. There are many subspecies of Katarns found on dozens of planets. As a rule, an adult individual exceeded the size of even a knight's horse of the Destry breed. The largest such horse weighed nearly a ton. Add to this the ability of the Katarns to climb trees, move almost silently, good speed, lightning-fast reaction, strong teeth and lack of fear of attack on a larger and well-armed individual, though not much bigger. Katarns played a large role in Wookiee culture. Sometimes Katarns was called Old Princes, believing that these mighty animals had once fallen to the planet from the heavens. The Wookiee, respecting the strength, secrecy, mystery and danger of the Katarns, held an annual ceremony in their honor called Herd Taik. Translated from Wookiee to normal Wookiee, this means test of ascension, or simply put, rite of passage. During this rite, Wookiee hunting parties descended to the lower levels of the Great Forest and began a multi-day hunt for Katarns, or Katarns hunted them as the case may be, although the main purpose of the trial was not to kill or even catch Katarns, but simply to survive. The lower levels of the Great Forest, also known as the Shadowlands, were very difficult to survive in, even without the predators running around. In the Shadowlands, one could occasionally come across the rarest species of Katarn or even larger predators that could no longer climb trees. If you were lucky enough to catch a baby Katarn, sometimes it could be tamed and raised as a pet, more specifically, a fighting riding animal. Wookiee riders on the Katarn, they were called dragon soldiers, dragon trooper, a very rare and highly respected type of Wookiee cavalry, or rather lizardmen. The word Cathar, inside a galaxy far, far away, has become a noun. If you have been given the nickname Katarn, you are a tough, secretive and generally dangerous man. That's why in different times the word Katarn was met as nicknames, surnames, names of ships and special forces. For example, the famous special unit of the New Republic Katarn Commandos, created by Bandamir and led by Jada Page. Sounds beautiful, menacing. Everything mentioned above about Katarn beasts is in both the old and new canons, though the new one is a little more detailed. Armor of the Katarn type is also present in two canons at once. But so far, the only useful thing that the so-called new canon has given us in this matter is the price of the armor, which is 6,500 full Republican dollars. Expensive, of course, but not prohibitively expensive in the original Star Wars. In the expanded universe, that is, the price tag on the armor Katarn we never saw, not counting only information that on the black market, it could be bought for a fabulous 1,000,000 credits. For this money, by the way, you could buy a good light space fighter or a simple heavy fighter or quite a good light transport. As it was mentioned earlier, Kaminoans did not save money on armor for special forces, thank them for that. While the armor of clones and then stormtroopers was made of a tricky kind of plastic, or rather a polymer called plastoid, Katarn armor was made of duroplast. Despite the plastoid in the name, duroplast had nothing to do with plastic. It is such a steel, a white-colored alloy capable of withstanding very high temperatures, as well as high static and dynamic loads. The Katarn's breastplate was nearly impossible to penetrate with light blasters, including hunting models, and difficult to penetrate with army blaster rifles, even at short range. Though if you tried hard enough and shot diligently, in the company of a few more of the same daredevils, you could certainly penetrate it. But it is unlikely that the armor-clad commander will let you fire a second line at his precious carcass. Bullet weapons, including firearms, did not penetrate the armor at all, well, with rare exceptions like Verbin's small arms. So far, we know that bullets do not penetrate Katarn armor, or penetrate it with great difficulty. If you have a slugger and you want to kill Clone's armor Katarn, There are really a few options. Well, if you are a sniper from God, that is from the Force, and you are lucky enough to hit a number of vulnerable places, namely in the articulation of the armor, visor, or in the area of the gorget, where the armor is a little thinner, then there is some chance. And if you want to kill a fighter in this armor so that, with a guarantee, the advice, take a stationary blaster like VEB or high-speed rotary blaster cannon like Z6, compensating for the lack of power with speed. In general, the armor of the C'tans, in terms of armor resistance, was almost on a par with the armor of the Archons of the first and second phases, a little stronger and a little heavier. The C'tan, even the very first model, were equipped with a protective field generator, a deflector not very powerful, but it could absorb a few shots from a blaster rifle and reduce the damage from a laser or blaster cannon. The armor was completely sealed, capable of withstanding extremely high and extremely low temperatures. Inside it, the oxygen supply was sufficient for 20 minutes, which was usually enough to board an enemy vessel or swim stealthily underwater. Well, and if for some reason 20 minutes was not enough for you, you can always attach an external breathing apparatus to your backpack. For example, a rebreather from a set of equipment for combat swimmers. The modular backpack allowed me to do all sorts of things. It could be adapted to perform a variety of combat tasks by pushing in an automatic Bacta dispenser, a battery of blaster gas for weapons, a grenade, explosives, rations, and all sorts of gadgets. Anything up to miniature jamming equipment and optical cloaking equipment, though the latter was extremely rare. Even rarer was a rocket launcher like the Mandalorians had. More often, C'tan armor was painted in a protective color with some special paint, supplemented with a clever stealth coating, after which the unit is extremely difficult to detect by all means of detection, especially with the naked eye. Of course, this did not extend to finding special forces units that were painted like parrots. The fighter would simply blend in with the surrounding terrain. Later, a similar stealth coating would be used by the special forces of the Galactic Empire, a description of which we will get to. And finally, the helmet, the most favorite piece of equipment of any clone or stormtrooper. The Spetsnazer armor bucket was a work of military technological art. Depending on the selected settings, it displayed the status of weapons and armor, account level blaster battery reserve, how much gas was left in your plasma gun, the location of other squad members, a three-dimensional mini-map, the distance to the target, the nature of the target, and the electronics could illuminate the selected target, whether it was a human or a machine. The aiming point could be displayed on the screen, taking into account the prejudice, corrected for the speed and direction of movement of targets. Naturally, the helmet had a built-in thermal imager, Nevada, night vision device, and binoculars effect, although the magnification is not reported. Also in the helmets of ordinary clones in the helmets of the C'tan, had built-in air filters, but unlike the clone helmet, which could extract oxygen from water and even from toxic environments and purify it, replenishing the reserves of the breathing apparatus of the armored suit. All in all, the helmet was a real piece of work. I recommend it. Elements of the rest of the armor were modular, like the Archon armor. That is, it was possible to attach retractable blades in the armor, as it is shown in the game Republic Commando, mini flamethrowers, miniature launchers, hello Mandalorians, and all sorts of other such equipment, which is enough imagination and sneakiness of the fighter. After all, to get special equipment was, oh, how difficult, and on request, the command of the special operation usually did not allocate such things. And here is all this fun, just some 20 kilograms, twice as much as the clone armor of Phase 1 and almost as much as the armor of the Archons. It's cool, isn't it? Cool, but expensive. In the new canon, it's more than 3 times the cost of a normal clone trooper's armor, though considering what the C'tan armor was capable of, it would have been worth the money. It was a pity that the misers in the Republican Senate didn't allow them to give such armor to at least a couple thousand clone infantrymen from select units, such as the 501st Legion or the 21st Kia de Mundi Corps, better known as the Galactic Paratroopers, although the latter still got the cool armor, power armor. If you've already rolled your lips at the C'tan armor, roll it back up. Commandos are also mortal, especially when they are commanded by dummies in bathrobes with lightsabers, and when the clone officers themselves are too confident in their abilities and underestimate the enemy. During the first major battle of the Clone Wars, the Battle of Geonosis, which was also one of the most massive ground battles of the entire war, most of the clone commandos died, despite their magnificent armor. Even well-trained fighters in the best equipment can easily die faster than dinosaurs because of the stupidity of commanders who misuse them. And the command thought, we have fighters in very strong armor, so let's drop them right on the separatists' heads in several key areas. Let them capture beachheads, blow up droid factories, use them as classic assault troops. I don't care if it's not their specialty. The outcome was sad. In 3 days of intense fighting, 4,982 of the 10,000 commandos were killed, almost 50% of the losses. Fortunately, the Jedi were more cautious afterward, and the clone officers began to treat the separatists with respect. Droids are droids, but they can still fight, especially when there are a lot of them. No matter how cool the armor is, soldiers can never have enough. Besides, since ordinary clones are demanding better equipment, how can we be any worse, thought the commandos. Let's ask for the same soup and pour it in thicker. After the first special operations, the clones of commandos from among those who survived the massacre on Geonosis, or did not participate in it at all, demanded a number of small apologies in their armor. Exactly minor ones, not a complete replacement of the heavy armor, as the ordinary infantry had requested. Special Operations Command said we must. The Kaminoans said check. And to make sure there was got it, they demanded more money. What can you do? I had to put up some more money because they were valuable guys and there was no place to get new ones. Let them live happily ever after in the best armor, to the envy of mere clones. Armor Catan II, or Catan's second model Mark II, went into small-scale production 4 months after the start of the war. There was improved protection from EMI weapons, that is, from the electromagnetic pulse, capable of disabling the electronics of the armor, and slightly changed the composition of the alloy of armor plates, increasing their strength against bullets. Now even the toughest bullet weapons, not counting large caliber weapons, were like a pellet to a fighter in Catan armor. The already good protection against shrapnel was increased. Now the armor could withstand the explosion of a grenade, even if it was a grenade from an underbarrel grenade launcher that hit the armor directly. And what do you think? The commando clones had enough of it? Yeah, sure, they asked for more. I mean, more awesome. The Kaminoans didn't mind. They put out their paws for more coins. And the Special Operations Command grumbled and went into a hole in their wallet to find something else to spare. Armor Cathan III Cathan Mark III appeared 10 months after the beginning of the Clone Wars. It instantly appeared on the bodies of commandos who love cool toys so much. Kids. Every clone is 10 years old. At one time, people joked that the young Jedi Etain Tur-Yukon, who had a child with Commando ARS 1136 named Dorman, was in fact a pedophile. This one was already in her early 20s, an adult by the look of it. And the clone was only 12 years old at the time, a minor, only a juvenile, 5'6", pumped-up blaster, power armor. Let's not get distracted by the armor. Catan III was distinguished by a whole set of improvements. First, even more increased the strength of armor plates in opposition to energy weapons. Now the breastplate could withstand a direct hit from a plasma discharge fired from a machine blaster, though it wasn't worth the risk. And the light laser cannon, and now the armor also penetrated with difficulty, but still penetrated. The aforementioned polymer stealth coating, successfully tested by the Omega Squad, was now mandatory. Well, and a few other small improvements in electronics, which, however, we decided not to inform us about. The durability of Catan armor, especially the Catan on the second and third models, was clearly demonstrated by a counter-terrorist operation conducted by the Omega Squad in one of the Coruscant spaceports. Then a commander with PC 8015, aka Filed, covered himself with a bomb, protecting policemen in light body armor. The bomb exploded, the armor was damaged, but the FAI himself got off with a slight fright. Then everyone fell in love with the clone for his heroism, and they loved special forces in general. Maybe the clones would have wanted to have a fourth-generation armor, but Cathan IV never happened. Command said enough. Well, enough is enough, the clones thought, and went on killing and overpowering. After the Clone Wars were over and Order 66 was mostly successful, Commando's clones were still needed. The galaxy was full of underdog leaders, separatists, terrorist groups, pirate gangs, and fugitive under-slaughtered Jedi. All in all, they had plenty of work to do, but the equipment remained the same, except now the color variety and painting had come to an end. Everyone had the same gray or black armor. Clones of commandos continued to be used until the end of their operational life, so to speak. Clones aged twice as fast as regular humans. After the last special commandos from the test tube were retired, the cathartic armor was no longer produced. Another Republican special unit with special equipment was the Shadow Clone Trooper. If you have already asked yourself, why another type of special forces when there are already ARC-clones, ARF-clones, clones of commandos, so I will answer you. All the others served the Grand Army of the Republic and were part of the Brigade of Special Operations Forces, and the intelligence of the Galactic Republic wanted to have their own Special Forces units, so as not to depend on the military command, and thus act more quickly without fear of publicity. The idea to create a special unit of shadows belonged to the director of the Republican and then Imperial Intelligence, Armando Isard. It was his daughter who would later take his place and be a pain in the ass for the new Republic. The Shadow Clones' equipment was based on the armor of the second phase clones, differing only by a special coating of armor which made them very difficult to be seen by sensors and scanners. Nor were they seen by thermal imagers. Another curious feature, magnetic grips on the armor, which allowed them to attach various elements to make them look like a member of another race or a fighter of the Hutt Cartel or the Black Sun. Add to that holographic cloaking devices and you have a soldier who can disguise himself as anyone. And the Shadows were the only unit in the Republic, well except for the ARC-clones, who used unique blasters DC-19 with the colloquial name of Stealth. Their shot was invisible to the naked eye and completely silent, perfect for special operations. Then the DC-19 was used only by Imperial Special Forces and rarely by the rebels. It was thanks to Shadow Clones that Obi-Wan's troops were able to suddenly land on Utapau in the third episode, which was a surprise even to the paranoid Grievous, who always preferred to know in advance who, where, how, when, and why is climbing on his prosthetic soul. After the war, the Shadows assisted some of the Inquisitors in capturing Jedi and carrying out special assignments for the Emperor, with the personal permission and blessing of His Imperial Majesty in the capture and destruction of Jedi. There was also another special unit of clones who did not shy away from dirty work, but as part of the forces in special operations they were mentioned in one of the novels by K. Travis and Republic Commando as hunters of clone deserters. Among the clones were sometimes those scumbags, but scumbags who could kill well, including doing it covertly. They were good for the dirty work. In those cases, when they acted not in civilian clothes but in their armor and with standard weapons, they wore armor of the second phase, covered with a special replica steel spolymer. A very rare thing, used only by wealthy assassins, bounty hunters, and of course the special forces of some planets. In the future in the Empire, replica armor will be worn by the famous assault commandos. The only thing that all types of commandos lacked, besides conscience, of course, was power armor. Although they could have made it based on existing armor, just increasing the thickness of the armor plates, compensating for the increased weight with an exoskeleton. The commando clones were more often engaged in assault operations than stealthy infiltration and sabotage anyway, and the Republic already had experience in using power armor. But somehow it didn't work out. Power armor in Star Wars has always been a bit of an aside, rarely appearing on the pages of books, comics, and games, and not even glimpsed in the movies. Nevertheless, exoskeletons in general and power armor in particular were not unique and were mass-produced. But it was not worn often because it was expensive. The first serial samples of power armor in the future used in the Empire appeared in the years of the Clone Wars. Tests in combat conditions were conducted by the famous Galactic Marines, elite soldiers of the 21st Nova Corps, 4th Sector Army, Grand Army of the Republic Corps under the command of the esteemed Jedi Master Ki-Adi-Mundi. They were masters of amphibious operations and boarding. Who better to entrust them with such an important task as testing power armor? Incidentally, the clones of this unit had previously distinguished themselves in the hardest battles for Renvar and many others. Galactic paratroopers were well known to the enemy. Their commanders valued them, and their appearance on the battlefield caused panic fear in any soldier of the Separatist army, unless, of course, he was a droid. Only the best clones went there, like the 501st Legion. Skilled paratrooper fighters with a not-so-developed sense of self-preservation. When boarding starships, galactic marines not only penetrated through docking airlocks and hangars, which is always expected by the defenders, but also landed in spacesuits on the ship's hull, then penetrated the hull with overhead charges, laser cutters, or climbed through technical hatches. In the battle for New Bornalex, the troopers used experimental armored spacesuits, power armor. The clone's new armored garb greatly enhanced the soldier's physical strength to the level of AB-2 droid and allowed him to fly through space at decent speeds, as well as having built-in armaments. The clones passed the battle test, but their experimental armor did not fare so well. During the battle, the built-in armament of most spacesuits worked poorly or refused to fire at all, but the clones were not confused. They attacked the droids in hand-to-hand in space. Thanks to the servos that increased the physical strength of the soldiers several times, the clones punched through the bodies of droids B2 with their fist and broke the droidek with their kicks, while droids B1 had enough of a backhand. The result of the battle for New Bornalex was as follows. The clones were satisfied, the losses were minimal, but the power armor was sent for revision. It took a long time to twist, turn, compile, and file the armor, so the clones never saw it until the end of the war. They had to kill their father commander during Order 66 in the traditional way. The Galactic Empire used the modified version of the power armor, and the Imperial budget was enough to establish large-scale production of armored spacesuits in a short period of time. In the first few years, no less than 100,000 sets of power armor were produced. A modest circulation on the scale of the Imperial Army, but still, then came the second generation of power armor. Back to the Clone Wars. The clones of the Grand Army wore another variant of power armor worth talking about. At the very beginning of the Clone Wars, it was believed that artillery, orbital bombardment, and rocket bombing from the air would be enough to break through a well-fortified enemy defense, after which the infantry, supported by tanks and a pedimobile, would be able to finish off the weakened enemy. But life has made its adjustments. Not everywhere the nature of the terrain or urban development allowed the use of tanks, and it was not always possible to use artillery. To break through the defenses needed soldiers in very strong armor, because soldiers in ordinary light armor unreasonably high losses. This is how the so-called Blaze Troopers came into being. For the first time, we meet them in a weak arcade game based on the third episode. It was called Episode 3, Revenge of the Sith. The game was released in 2005 on PlayStation 2 and boxed. As a supplement to the movie, and on the wave of popularity of the movie, sold well, which is not surprising. Then Blaze Troopers appeared in several guides, such as Clone Wars Campaign Guide. Several of these fighters were sent to the Jedi Temple on Coruscant to meet former generals there. The most common weapon used by these clones was the flamethrower. The flamethrower could be replaced by a blaster cannon or a multi-barrel rapid-fire blaster, and anything heavier, up to and including an automatic grenade launcher or machine gun blaster, could be used. The blaze armor of the troopers gave excellent protection from small arms and shrapnel, and like most power armor in Star Wars, allowed them to fly short distances. The Blaze Trooper armor used a pair of jet engines to fly. Immediately after the end of the Clone Wars, by order of Emperor Palpatine, a new elite branch of space troopers, that is, space infantry, was created as part of the Assault Corps. Only the best soldiers were selected. At first, they were clones, and then ordinary people. In terms of combat and ideological training, space troopers were second only to the guards and assault commandos. Space troopers used different types of protective equipment. They were very fashionable in that respect. Sometimes it was the usual Stormtrooper armor, complete with a pair of tanks and a small engine for open space flight. But more often, space troopers were associated with power armor. There were several types of armor too. At first, Imperial space troopers used a modified version of the clone power armor that had been so successfully tested by the 21st Corps at the Battle of New Bornalex. Then they used an improved version of it, in which the soldier had not only great physical strength but also could fly in space at high speed. At the same time, the power armor did not restrain movement. And then there was a heavy version of the armor, which became a true symbol of this kind of troops. It doesn't look pretty, doesn't it? It lacks beauty and pathos. But armor doesn't have to look beautiful. This power armor was impossible to penetrate with light and heavy blaster and firearms. It could easily withstand fragments of hand grenades, The armor could be used in ultra-low or ultra-high temperatures. Due to the hermetic sealing, the fighter could not fear the enemy's use of chemical, radiation, and bacteriological weapons. The built-in armament was also impressive. The main weapon was a light blaster cannon. In addition to it was a grenade launcher with an effective range of 200 meters and ammunition of 30 high-explosive fragmentation gas or stun grenades. In addition could be installed a launcher of proton mini-torpedoes, which could be used to shoot down a fighter or make a hole in an armored door. Well, and to top it all off, the power armor would have a built-in laser cutter for making holes in the hull of an enemy vessel. It's a torch the Stormtroopers have learned to use as a melee weapon. It wasn't a lightsaber, but it would make a hole just as well. The power armor was designed to be used at the same time as the standard Stormtrooper armor. This was done for a reason. There was a chance that the suit could be damaged during a boarding raid, or the soldier, for whatever reason, would have to leave without the standard Stormtrooper armor. Under boarding conditions, a soldier could die by suffocating or freezing to death in the unsealed compartment of an enemy vessel. And in the case of disabling power armor, the soldier was not defenseless. Of course, it was possible to work in a spacesuit and without assault armor, but it was extremely uncomfortable. Movement in the armor was driven by 4 repulsors. The main ones were in a unit behind the back and 2 were in the feet. The last also acted as maneuvering thrusters. Although the power armor was designed to operate in space, it could also be flown in the atmosphere, though not for long. This allowed space troopers to be used occasionally as an alternative to the trooper. For example, to conduct amphibious assault operations against entrenched enemies. Running in this armor was difficult, so they preferred to move with the help of repulsors, that is, flying. The built-in life support system had an oxygen reserve of 10 hours. The batteries were sufficient for 4 hours of continuous operation. In the legs of the armor was a built-in medical injector. The power armor's mini-pharmacy contained stimulants, painkillers, and antiseptics. If a soldier was lightly or severely wounded, panicked, or concussed, the system assessed his condition and gave a command to inject a particular drug into the soldier's bloodstream. If a stormtrooper was severely wounded or lost a creation, the automation could maintain life in the wounded soldier's body until medics arrived. The bizards and external surveillance cameras of the power armor had built-in night vision devices and were synchronized with the standard stormtrooper armor. 2 flashlights were mounted on either side of the head. The creator of the armor was Dr. Nashiak Lalik. His armor, by the way, was called Sunda 9 Power Armor. Dr. Lake was a great expert in creating various types of protective gear. In particular, he was the one who created the armor of such elite units as the Assault Commandos and Radiation Zone Assault Troopers. Nashiak Lalik's younger sister, named Saren, who served in intelligence, believed her brother could be recruited by persuading him to create power armor for the Rebel Alliance and later the New Republic. Though without his help, New Republic soldiers sometimes, but very rarely, appeared on the battlefields wearing power armor, not of Imperial manufacture, of course. Shortly before the Battle of Endor, an improved version of Cosmo Infantry power armor appeared. The first and second models were used by the Shard's space troopers throughout the Galactic Civil War. Fortunately for the New Republic, power armor was expensive to produce and expensive to maintain, and the Shard had few soldiers trained to wear power armor. I mentioned above that space infantry and their power armor could participate in battles on the surface of the planet, but it would be like hammering nails with a microscope. That is, it would be an inappropriate use. Besides, the Empire had its own version of power armor for planetary operations. It was worn by the so-called hazard troopers. This is a kind of heavy infantry designed for fighting in areas contaminated by chemical weapons, high radiation, acid rain. In general, these soldiers fought in places where a normal person would not live long or would die in a few seconds in terrible agony from some contagion in the air. Hazard stormtroopers were altered to wear power armor. They were given gene therapy and their limbs replaced with mechanical prosthetics. The Adeptus Mechanicus would have been pleased. These guys had everything they wanted built into their power armor: a diagnostic system for the soldier's condition, a set of chemicals to cleanse the body of any contagion, drugs to heal wounds, and all sorts of aiming systems in the helmet. A soldier in armor could stay up to 3 days in almost any contaminated environment, in open space or at great depths underwater. Except that running in this armor was impossible. You met hazard troopers in the game Jedi Knight, Jedi Academy on the planet Vyun. There they were walking under acid rain and trying to kill our hero Jaden Core. This joy was not cheap. 18000 credits, 9 times more expensive than the Stormtrooper armor. That's why there was a lot of this armor in the Empire. Well, more often, of course, not visible, because a mistake is expensive. The Stormtroopers, of course, disagreed. And so we smoothly got to the Galactic Empire, and more precisely to the iconic armor of the Imperial Stormtroopers. Having listened carefully to all the previously said, you probably already asked yourself, why was it necessary to change something if the armor of the second phase of the clones was already good and beautiful? But there is no limit to perfection. The military always wants better equipment, and politicians want what's cheap and what they can spare. Not their sons and daughters will die in it, and clones will be made. Very rarely the desperation of some and the possibilities of others come together. But in this case, the stars have more or less aligned. In the last year of the war already, Republican designers were working on improving the armor of the second phase, which ended right at the end of the war. When they were testing the Stormtrooper armor, Obi-Wan Kenobi was just sending Grievous to the next world. Therefore, the first series of new armor clones began to receive in 2 weeks after the war, but it was the first batch. Imperial engineers from the IDMR, Imperial Department of Ministry Research, or IDMR for short. These events happened in the first year after the start of serial production. After that, nothing was changed in the armor, only modifications were produced. The armor of the second phase was sent to Army Reserve warehouses just in case, along with decommissioned small arms and some military equipment. Immediately after the Clone Wars, the Imperial Army began to be formed from Republic militia units made up of ordinary people who participated in the Clone Wars alongside the clones themselves. After the war, the degree of patriotism was off the charts. Many wanted to serve the new state, the Galactic Empire. That's why there were no problems with understaffing, but there were problems with equipment and weapons. As a result, the Imperial Army mostly wore mass-produced light terraces and open helmets without any aiming electronics, climate control, and other innovations. Only some divisions and regiments, shortly before the events of the movies, changed to Stormtrooper armor. Remember the movie about Han Solo? What kind of gear was he running around in? That was the standard Imperial Army gear. With the Phase 2 clone armor being shipped to the warehouses, their journeys had just begun. These warehouses were poorly guarded, and some of the more daring road warriors who wanted to get their hands on the treasury would sometimes raid the warehouses, taking everything out. And then, nobody could find them. Stolen armor soon appeared on the black market and was worn by pirates and mercenaries, which was especially frustrating for Stormtrooper clones. Some of the armor was found on the battlefields. You took out a dead clone, fixed the hole, repaired what was broken, and you can go on fighting. The most clever and courageous comrades in epaulets began a happy life. Sometimes they stole themselves, sometimes they helped others to steal for a little money. Quietly carried away, written off, sold on the black market and satisfied. After all, the warehouses were rarely checked. On the black market, the clone armor of the second phase was sold like hotcakes. No wonder the armor was of high quality. Republican Imperial engineers managed to combine the pleasant with the useful for a relatively low price and high quality. The Stormtrooper armor was even cheaper than the clone armor, 2,000 credits, 1,000 cheaper than the set of the second phase, and the same price as the failed armor of the first phase. Lowering the price while still being able to clone armor was vital to the Imperial Stormtroopers. Moreover, it was the cost that came first in this case. Emperor Palpatine needed a very massive army to assert his power and prepare to meet the uninvited guests. In such a situation, the difference of even 50 kopecks on the scale of a multi-million-dollar army is no joke. If the armor of the second phase was cheaper, most likely they would not have been changed. It was in them that the Stormtrooper clones would run. But shortly before the Vong invasion, the new Empire had enough enemies, and something had to be done about it. What at first appears to be good and fluffy in reality turns out to be grey and hairy. The Empire itself has sometimes overreached, rushing from one extreme to another in establishing its trademark peace in outer peace and order. With its determination, uncompromisingness, the Empire unwittingly acted into the hands of all the dissatisfied, who then began to be patronized by the future leaders of the largest rebel movement in the galaxy, the Rebel Alliance. The same Mon Mothma was at first an Imperial senator and was a typical oppositionist, but realizing that there was no way she could regain power peacefully, she took the path of armed rebellion, turning from oppositionists into the leader of the Rebel Alliance. The first thing all surviving clones of the Great Army of the Republic were reorganized into the Assault Corps or the Assault Corps. But where to get new people, or rather clones, a year before the end of the war in the 20th year before Yavin? In an effort to replenish the greatly reduced ranks of the Grand Army, Supreme Chancellor Palpatine, secretly from most senators, authorized the cultivation on the planet Syntax II. The clones were grown using accelerated Arcanian technology, using Sparti planning cylinders. They were later called Sparti clones, although that name was not the official term. Officially, however, they were considered the same as Kaminoan clones. Using accelerated Arcanian technology, finished soldiers could be produced in as little as a year. The quality was, of course, poor, but the soldiers were fast. Palpatine asked, "Let's make a primitively fast lot." So the clone creators did it. Such droids of meat and bones turned out, but in terms of combat effectiveness, were at the level of soldiers of the Imperial Army or late stormtroopers of new recruits. Instead of 7 years of combat training, Sparti clones were pumped with information directly into their immature brains and trained in the usual way, literally in a couple of months. Then they put armor on them and sent them to a combat unit. "Go, serve. If you die, it's no big deal. We'll bend you over." Syntax II was very far from Kamino, on the core worlds, the very sector of Coruscant near the capital. But the clones were told that they were raised on Kamino so that the original clones wouldn't have strange questions when they met them. But questions still came up as soon as the Sparti clones entered the battle. Older clones could easily figure out this fake before the battle. The ability to wear armor was a kind of initiation for a new clone back on Kamino. The newcomers always moved uncertainly in their armor, and their movements lacked the smoothness, the measuredness of seasoned veterans. And when it came to combat, the Sparti clones went straight ahead like school children to the cafeteria, rarely used cover, and shot so crookedly that the Kaminoan clones did not smash their helmets with a facepalm, so as not to embarrass the experienced clone soldiers with the new immature, in every sense, replenishment. Sparti clones were at first reduced to separate units. The 14th Infantry Brigade, for example, was formed exclusively from Sparti clones. The brigade's participation in the Battle of Hargabi, that's in the middle ring in the Spirva sector, was a field test of the new clone strain, and the full-scale deployment of the new clones was to take place a few months later, when the number of battle-ready clone units would reach several million pieces. But due to the events of the final weeks of the war, the process had to be accelerated. At the very end of the war, and immediately afterward, Sparti clones began to be used to make up for losses in clone units of the Kaminoan variety. After the war, the Galactic Empire legally restricted cloning for private interests. Now, to grow even a small batch of clones, you had to get a whole bunch of permits from the government, although the legal restriction on cloning sentient beings for non-military purposes had been banned as far back as the Galactic Senate of the Republic. It stated the following: military cloning may only be performed by organizations licensed by the Senate of the Republic, such as the Kamino government or others designated by the Republic in time of war. This restriction applies to cloning equipment, the hiring of technicians and genetic engineers to perform cloning operations, the purchase of cloned sentient beings, and so on, exemptions, home, herb, calends, and arcaniums. They may continue cloning for medical purposes with appropriate licenses issued on a per-order basis. Not to be limited by legislation, the Empire nationalized many clone factories, rolling out its own mass production of cannon fodder. At the same time, cloning continued on the Kamino. The calculation was as follows. On Kamino, they make high-quality clones with a long period of maturation, and on all other factories, they clone fast clones according to the Arcanian technology of Sparti and clones according to the G-Node project. And in addition, the number of genetic templates was increased. In just a few years, the number of Sparti clones was increased to several billion. Because of this, The number of Sparty clones in the Assault Corps exceeded the number of Kaminoan clones already in the second post-war year, when the remnants of separatists and large pirate gangs, together with the first emerging rebel movements, were being eliminated. The advantage of Sparty clones was obvious, grown in only 1 year and already ready for combat use, and also not aging twice as fast as Kaminoan clones. The disadvantages of the Sparty clones stemmed from their same main advantage, rapid maturation. Neuroprogramming and simulations where all the seemingly necessary information is downloaded into the cloned item's head cannot compensate for the lack of sufficient practice in real gear and with real weapons on a real range. Secondly, for normal maturation of clones, according to Arcanian specialists, it was necessary from 3 to 5 years. Only in this way the brain would have time to digest the necessary information, but the Emperor couldn't wait. Because of this, Sparty clones often suffered from a whole set of mental disorders, especially schizophrenia. Sometimes and often they opened fire on their own brothers if they were not isolated in time. Thrawn managed to eliminate this shortcoming only many years later, when the blue-skinned art historian came up with the idea to compensate for the lack of people in his army with clones. The clones were very talented and mentally stable, nuggets of their own. Rare of them, the most capable, even got into the ranks of Special Forces of Clone Commandos. As an example of a soon-to-be Special Forces commando, we can remember TK 7558, nicknamed RD. He is found in the novel Imperial Commando 501st. Mentioned cloning program Gaynode method of cloning was almost the same as the Conian cylinder Sparty, but the program of training and programming of cloned brains was very different. More precisely, they didn't feel like clones. That was the point. Unlike the clones grown by the Kaminoan and Artomian methods, they believed they were real people. They were given real names and fake biographies were put into their brains. All of this was necessary for each clone to develop as a unique individual, roughly like Kaminoan clones, but growing quickly. But unlike the Kaminoan variety of genode clones, and without any chips in their heads, were absolutely loyal to the Galactic Empire, and could not allow even the slightest thought of betraying the Emperor. As a result, before the famous and previously mentioned rebellion on Kamino, the number of clones of this variety in the Assault Corps for some time amounted to 40%. Sparty clones accounted for roughly the same proportion. The remaining 20% was taken up by high-quality Kaminoan clones. Alas, both R and Gaynode clones had the same mental problems as the Sparty clones, especially when they started to wonder about their origins and saw thousands of the same identical cloned faces around them. The clone would begin to think that everyone around him was a traitor who had decided to disguise themselves as him. After that, the clone would pick up his regular blaster and start shooting left and right with a sense of national duty until he was calmed down with a shot in the forehead. The disadvantages of clones of all 3 types of cultivation and all available varieties were obvious. The main disadvantage was that it was expensive. Clones, especially Kaminoan clones, are a very, very expensive commodity. From the cost of the finished product in the hundreds of thousands of credits. After all, the clone had to be raised, fed, clothed and treated, and of course trained. And all this in conditions when there are a trillion of fanatically patriotic citizens around you, brainwashed to a mirror shine by imperial propaganda and study in groups. This is such an analogue of the youth. And there were also a lot of just physically strong citizens who loved the Empire without fanaticism and saw a military career in their future. So there were a lot of people to choose from. And it was obviously better than choosing between very expensive Kaminoan clones and cheap but shitty Arcanian and Genode clones, and the choice was so big that no one even thought of producing Stormtrooper armor of different sizes. They just took people tall enough and strong enough. The requirements for admission to the Assault Corps were as follows: height from 1.79 m to 1.85 m, weight from 78 to 85 kilograms, intelligence level of Barev's test 790 or higher. The maximum on this test was 1,000, so it's a B+. In the Imperial Army, you could be taken with 2s and a meter tall, but in the Stormtroopers, there was a selection process. That's why Luke stood out so much for his short stature, which was immediately noticed by Leia Organa in the 4th episode. It was after Eldor that the Stormtroopers began to enroll soldiers of the army and take anyone they could find. By the way, there were so few women in the Stormtrooper Corps because of the high height requirements. Not many, but there were still a few. And their armor was no different from the men's. The standard cuirass had enough room for breasts, even if nature had endowed a young lady with voluminous mammary glands. And given the distortion of her voice by the helmet battery, it was hard to tell what sex she was when she met a stormtrooper. When valuable people began to be accepted into the Storm Corps in the 12th year before Yavin, that is 7 years after the Clone Wars. Cloning continued on Kamino, but clone factories were shut down on most planets. Ironically, Kamino was occupied by their own creations, or rather products. Mentally unstable clones were slowly decommissioned and disposed of, at the same time retiring Kaminoan clones who were unable to continue heavy military service due to illness or injury. A sort of nursing home or home for the disabled was provided for them. Most of the Kaminoan clones that survived served to the end, either in combat units or in training units, where they trained future stormtroopers from ordinary people. A prime example is a long-lived clone named TH-312, and his nickname is Tucker. During the Clone Wars, he served under a Jedi Knight general. Although he respected his commander, he still believed Palpatine did the right thing by exterminating the Jedi. His general was a very curious character. He had, shall we say, in a rather interesting way, gone mad. The scale of training stormtroopers from regular humans was so great that by the time of the movies of the original trilogy, only a third of the Stormtrooper Corps consisted of clones. But that's something I've talked about before. New armor began to be developed back in the middle of the Clone Wars, but the first batches were ready by the end of the war and began arming the advanced units of the new Assault Corps a couple weeks after the Republic turned into the Empire. This is particularly mentioned in the novel Imperial Commando and the encyclopedia The Essential Guide to Warfare. But it was simply impossible to rearm everyone and quickly, so even 2 years after the Clone Wars there were units in the armor of the second phase, and special units of the Imperial Inquisition, those very Purganschicks from the new canon, continued to wear the old armor of the second phase even 5 years after the war, except that repainted in black and covered with some tricky polymer that gave some protection from the lightsaber. It didn't help them much though. Structurally, the new armor, Stormtrooper armor, became easier to look at and somewhat simpler. The number of armor plates was reduced. There were 20 and now there are 18. Easier to make and faster to put on, while the mobility became even better than the armor of the second phase, including the weight reduction. The complete set weighed only 10 kilograms. Together with weapons and ammunition, the weight of the entire assault vehicle's gear rarely exceeded 16 to 18 kilograms. All electronic stuffing of helmets of the first and second phase of armored clones remained in place. It showed itself well during the war and did not change. And that's right, but something else was added. First of all, MFT, multi-frequency trusting ink vision systems, multi-frequency targeting and information acquisition system. This system is very much loved by stormtroopers. A pair of sensors in the helmets automatically collected information about what was going on around them, and the processor in the helmet processed it and instantly gave it to the user. MFT was mainly used to gather information about objects and live targets at long range in low visibility conditions. In addition, MFT assisted in targeting, illuminating the target even in conditions of heavy smoke, fire, heavy rain, and similar visual disturbances. And lastly, MFT automatically calculated the correction for target movement. The first variant of them, MFT, appeared in the helmets of ARC clones and were in the helmets of Armor Cathan, clone commandos, and now they have become mass-produced, installed in all Buckethead's helmets, as the stormtroopers were called by the civilians. People of low intelligence may now start idiotically giggling, remembering dumb jokes about slanted stormtroopers, forgetting what a movie staple is, what a movie convention is. In Star Wars lore and in both the expanded universe and the new canon, many times the superb marksmanship of even ordinary stormtroopers is noted. Even in the movie, when in the sight of the stormtroopers is not the main character, they shoot very accurately. Suffice it to recall the boarding of the Corvette Tanta 4, where the stormtroopers attacked from an unfavorable position, lost only 3 dead quickly and dashingly mowed down all the Alderaanian guardsmen, and several taken prisoner. Too bad the stormtroopers were not allowed to use grenades because of the princess on board and the valuable data on the Death Star. Then casualties might have been avoided. Or the assault on the Echo base on Hoth in Episode 5, which was defended by some of the most experienced fighters in the Rebel Alliance, including several special forces such as the Renegade Squad. The stormtroopers suffered losses, of course, but incomparably fewer than the Rebel Alliance. Or if we move away from the movies, we can remember the battle on the Rebel Alliance's asteroid base, AX-456, where the Rebel Communications Center was located. It's in the Barmer sector in the colony region. Then just 3 assault squads, about 30 soldiers, encountered unexpectedly strong resistance. A total of 450 insurgent fighters, many of them from the Alliance's Special Operations Forces, temporarily stranded at the base. 30 stormtroopers against 450 insurgents. That's a 15-1 ratio. Of course, it would have been more sensible to retreat and visit again, but in a more representative company, but the stormtroopers did not succeed. As a result of the intense battle, about 20, probably 22 stormtroopers were killed, and attention, 436 fighters of the Rebel Alliance, including special forces, lost 22, killed 436. Although it's fair to say that the stormtroopers could have all died there if not for the initiative, if not for the resourcefulness of Kyle Katarn. Yes, the same Kyle Katarn who was still an Imperial stormtrooper at the time. Or here's another example. The story Commandy Season, where a small squad of Thrawn stormtroopers dashingly and exemplarily carried out a special operation with the boarding of a ship of the first aggressive and extremely self-confident race. And another misconception that clones are supposedly cooler, more agile and more evil because they were able to shoot Jedi, and people forget about the effect of surprise, forget that not all Jedi they managed to kill and so on. So some people believe that the stormtroopers were unable to kill a Jedi. They could do it, and not just clone stormtroopers could. A rugged stormtrooper known by the nickname Iron Arm, iron-handed. He got the nickname because of his prosthetic arm, and he lost his arm in a battle with a Jedi. True, his entire squad was killed in the process, but he accomplished his task. 8 stormtroopers is a small price to pay for a dead Jedi. By the way, he hated Jedi to the core and dreamed of killing or shooting another one for collection. But alas, he never got the chance. There were too few of them left in the galaxy, though some stormtroopers from other units had met Jedi. And there are plenty of examples of stormtroopers tearing everyone to shreds in Star Wars lore. The stormtroopers of the movie period are, on average, as good soldiers as their cloned predecessors. However, the dumb jokers with a belief in slanted stormtroopers didn't get any less of that. But let's not talk about the retarded and return to the consideration of armor. Another innovation was the auto-polarizing lenses. The lenses adapt to environmental conditions, for example, automatically darken to prevent damage to the retina as a result of an explosion. To be precise, they had been around before, but the lenses didn't work as fast or as well in the second phase of the armor. Plus, the new lenses gave a better view than the second phase, though not as wide as if you were looking with your own eyes, certainly not as wide as the helmets of SID fighter pilots, but it's still pretty decent. Because of this, experienced attack pilots preferred not to take off their helmets at all, looking at the world through the electronic optical eyes of their white buckets. By the way, if you read early versions of the script of Episode 4, written by Lucas himself, you might have noticed that the Stormtrooper armor appeared there as Taj Award's pasuit, that is, armored spacesuit of fighter pilots. Yes, at first the guys in white armor were supposed to be pilots, all armed with lightsabers and some with shields. Luckily, that idea was abandoned. By the way, the oblong thing on the Stormtrooper's belt later became a thermal detonator or a competent pouch, according to the situation. But originally it was the hilt of a lightsaber. Moving on, grill in the form of a stylized grinning face and inserts on the sides. This part of the helmet ventilation system, ribbed part on the sides and round in the front of the helmet, air filters. They were taken over from the helmets of the Phase 2 clones, and just like in the helmets of the Phase 2 clones, additional oxygen sources can be connected to them. Energy cells and most of the armored suit's air purification system were located inside the helmet in a kind of cheeks. The comlink underwent major changes. It had a signal encryption system before, but while the conversations of the clones of the first phase could be intercepted by some tough amateur radio operator, not to mention professionals with serious equipment, the conversations of the Stormtroopers were much harder to intercept. Although some rebel specialists could do it, one managed to do it with an electronic dog game cheating device stolen from a casino. The comlink automatically changed frequency and signal encoding every few seconds. And since all soldiers were now connected to a single information and control network, sometimes called an IDC circuit or IFC circuit, there were no communication problems. If a soldier removed his helmet without disabling the helmet electronics and turning on the comlink, which could be done with a glance or by touching a switch tongue near the microphone inside the helmet, he was instantly removed from the common information network and the helmet was locked. This is why Luke said in Episode 4 that he couldn't see anything in his helmet, and during the firefight he and Han took their helmets off. This was done for safety reasons, so that a superstat, having removed the helmet from the body of a dead soldier, could not dry talk the Stormtroopers. Simple and reliable system. Just imagine for a second how soldiers had to be kicked in the training school to develop the habit of blinking and licking their tongue before removing the helmet, so that later, when returning the helmet in place, they would not be a blind kitten with the prospect of getting a slap from the officer. Although even without it, there were a lot of systems and subsystems in the Stormtrooper armor, and to wear the armor correctly, you needed training. And to fully use all the functionality of the armor, a lot of experience, preferably, of course, combat experience. After all, in fact, soldiers wear on their heads not bad such a computer, and a helmet blocked by electronics was much cheaper on the black market. These it could be rewired like a cell phone if the skill was enough. By the way, the phrase "Luke, I see nothing in this helmet," was not originally in the script. It got the movie by accident when Mark Hamill complained that you gave him a helmet, did not make holes for the eyes. Lucas liked this phrase and it got the movie, becoming a mimetic later and as a passphrase played out in several films. And one more thing about the comlink. Now, thanks to the emergence of a unified information network, even built into the helmet, comlink short range could have a long signal range if the soldier was not far from his base or a repeater station, amplifying his signal. Also, the comlink of another assault vehicle could act as a repeater. This increased the range and stability of communication. It is unknown whether any audio and video recording system in the armor of the clones of the second phase. They probably did, but they forgot to tell us about it. But the helmets of the Stormtroopers definitely had a video recorder, recording absolutely everything. That is, you can't do much hooliganism, you can't shoot civilians, you can't steal government goods, you can't say anything unnecessary, it's boring. And then you can at your leisure all the platoon to see how someone bravely fought during the operation, who had what tactical errors, well, or who was embarrassed, having missed once again on the immortal protagonist with scripted armor. By the way, there is a funny moment in the game related to this. If you do not race through the locations with great speed and listen to what Stormtroopers talk about, you can hear a lot of funny things. For example, such as this. First Stormtrooper: "No, well, I'm telling you, he really pissed me off. He got on my nerves so much that I shot him. How was I supposed to know he was our Admiral's buddy?" "You could get shot for that," replies the second Stormtrooper. "Nah, come on, how would he know it was me? We all have the same armor." "Oh, you fool. Command can track who fired the blaster, when and where." "Ouch," replies Stormtrooper 1. "I gotta go check something out." Another useful little thing, motion sensors. Various sensors were still in the helmets of Phase 1, but the motion sensor wasn't there yet. It appeared in Phase 2 and became the norm in Phase 3, which is what Stormtrooper armor became. And finally, the ILS, or in English HUD, head-up display. It remained the same except that its functionality was somewhat expanded. Thanks to the appearance of transponders, there was no need for color markings on the armor. It was enough to look at another Stormtrooper and have his number and rank immediately appear on the screen. However, the tradition of wearing colored shoulder pads did not go away, although and gradually disappeared. High-ranking Stormtrooper officers or non-commissioned officers of elite units, such as the 501st Legion, often had protective field generators hidden in this very shoulder pad. Weak, but still sometimes helpful to survival, like a deflector in Cathan armor. When looking at a Stormtrooper, ordinary citizens saw the standard white helmets around them, and some even thought Stormtroopers were droids. But the fighter himself was bathed in an avalanche of incoming information. The stormtroopers also picked up the habit of clones chatting with each other without removing their helmets and standing or sitting still. So you walk by and see two stormtroopers standing silently at their post like statues. But in fact, they can actively discuss anything from the length of the skirt of a passing Twiwinkle and the shape of her thighs to works of art. And ordinary people walk by and marvel at the discipline and restraint of His Imperial Majesty's soldiers. The faceless helmets of the stormtroopers worked perfectly to create an atmosphere of mystery and fear in the camp of the enemies of the Empire. You kill one soldier and two more of the same kind take his place. Just as frightening, just as faceless. And here, loyal citizens of the Empire, after the Assault Corps began to accept contract volunteers, in each Imperial stormtrooper saw their protector, their son, brother, brother-in-law, husband, well, or in rare cases, a daughter or sister. The occasional appearance of stormtroopers on the city streets worked well for the maintenance of order and the reputation of the Imperial Armed Forces. And finally, the Emperor liked a faceless army. And the last advantage of the stormtrooper's helmet? It was the most durable part of the armor, along with the cuirass, and the assault gloves had not changed much, except that now it was possible to install electroshockers in them. This was very useful in apprehending criminals when stormtroopers on captured planets were forced to temporarily walk around inhospitable cities as a police force under the occupying administration. Sometimes stormtroopers would reinforce their wristbands and gloves and at their own expense make them impenetrable to vibro weapons. Some, especially dexterous fighters, even managed to intercept the blade of a sword or dagger with the hand in the reinforced glove. Here, however, I remember an old army wisdom, aka an anecdote. Question: when can you use your hand-to-hand combat skills in practice in war? Answer: when you lose your automatic rifle, pistol, knife, belt, spatula, helmet, and find yourself on absolutely bare ground where there is not a single stone or stick lying around. But moving on, the greaves of the armor remain mostly the same despite the change in their design. Of the differences, the extra emergency batteries on the right leg are the same cubes, and a change in the shape of the left kneecap. This was done to better protect the leg when firing from the knee. The Imperial Stormtrooper had a little more stuff hanging from his belt than his cloned ancestor. For example, they began to give everyone a cat with a cable, sometimes even with a launcher built into the cat itself or attached to the underbarrel to the blaster. There was also a flashlight with a powerful LED, also able to work as an infrared flashlight. That is, an infrared flashlight is not a bad addition to the built-in PNV. You can illuminate something without demasking yourself, but only if you don't have your own PNV. Also on the belt hung this ring. It is a dialyzer, which helps to keep the electronics of the armored suit intact. If the fighter falls under the explosion of an ion grenade, or someone will put someone in it from an ion blaster, power batons and handcuffs with stun guns could also be found on the belt. This is in case, as it was said earlier, if a soldier temporarily turned into a law enforcement officer in the occupied territory. And it was always necessary to swaddle a prisoner with something. All stormtroopers had an external comlink, in addition to the helmet-mounted comlink, just in case. By the way, the antenna of the built-in comlink was moved from the crest of the helmet, as in the first and second phases of the water armor, to this black rim. Squad commanders and all those who were higher up in the ranking table with bigger paychecks also wore multifunctional macro binoculars. It was basic equipment. If necessary, you could take something additional. Ordinary stormtroopers, called whites, rarely carried backpacks with additional ammunition and equipment. They were mostly carried by fighters of their respective specializations, such as snowtroopers and sendtroopers, who often had to operate in isolation, in small units of up to a company. And here, let me tell you about the differences in protective gear between stormtroopers and different specializations. Desert men wore standard stormtrooper armor, differing only in the presence of an improved cooling system and better air filters that have no problems even with very fine sand. A very useful thing, by the way, especially during sandstorms. By the way, these storms were a perfect cover for the deserters' actions. Nobody can see or hear them, but stormtroopers can see, hear, and breathe freely. Rad troopers, or radiation zone assault troopers, specialists in warfare under conditions of increased natural or artificial radiation. Their equipment was already noticeably different from the usual white ones, especially the helmets. The outer cuirass was the same, but had several layers of additional anti-radiation protection. Their gear included special equipment, ranging from dosimeters and water filters to special dry rations and cleaning and filtration system habits, in which it was even possible to remove the armor. Though even without taking off the armor, a rad trooper could fight for days. The armor had a food mixture system, and it was possible to go big and small without removing the armor, dumping the waste in a special bag afterwards. From the special weapons, they had carbines made by Soros Up Corporation, working at high radiation. And in case the radiation background was particularly high, they were given close combat weapons, vibromechs, vibrocoppers, vibro knives, except that there were no vibro saber blades. The helmets of rad troopers were equipped with very cool filters, so that the fighters could fight in zones of not only radiation but also chemical contamination. By the way, occasionally the Empire would deliberately bombard the enemy territory with dirty radiation bombs and then send in these very rad red troopers who would kill everything that still had the nerve to show signs of life or had time to take refuge in shelters. The rad trooper's junior colleagues in waging war in the unfriendly ass of the galaxy were his Evo troopers in Warman of Stormtrooper. Their area of interest was planets with polluted industry, dump planet atmospheres, planets with natural or man-made acid rain, and the like. Their armor differed from the usual stormtroopers, and naturally the presence of powerful filters, breathing apparatus and thicker overalls, as well as reinforced cuirasses and more massive shoulder pads. And there are few of what kind of nasties you will meet on the chemical wastelands. That is, the armor was not very different from the usual. And another difference, but already personal, since the polluted planets were often inhabited by representatives of non-human races. Most of these stormtroopers were racists. How much do you have to hate Xenos to voluntarily enlist in units that hang around all sorts of toxic dumps, garbage dumps, garbage dumps? Another stormtroopers are extreme. They are Magma Tagog Trooper, aka Magma Trooper, aka Lava Trooper. Their armor was externally the same as the regular stormtroopers, except that it was painted bright red. But the paint was actually a protective Duravlex alloy originally designed for droids and steel mills. Complementing it all was a cooling system. All of this allowed the stormtroopers to live and fight when it was over 1,000 degrees on the thermometer. That's a nice tan you got there. Darth Vader wouldn't lie. A magma stormtrooper could survive for a minute or two in temperatures up to 19,000. That's above the melting point of steel, by the way. But it was better to leave to cool down soon, or the fighter, even with a great cooling system, could boil in its own juice, even in special armor. These heat-resistant guys were used by the Empire on planets with very high temperatures and high volcanic activity. For example, on Mustafar. A small number of them were deployed on Sevasta, though the core of Sevasta's garrison was still made up of the most common stormtroopers. All because of the rarity of this specialization and the corresponding armor. Another rarity in the Assault Corps were shadow troopers, shadow soldiers. Not to be confused, and only them with Shadow Stormtrooper, about which more later. Their armor was the same as regular stormtroopers, but covered with Durasteel fibers for better durability and equipped with an optical cloaking system. Otherwise, the most ordinary stormtroopers. They were intended to support the Emperor's Shadow Guard in covert operations. It turned out to be a bad idea, and very soon Shadow and Shadow Guards disappeared like shadows. But the Shadow Stormtrooper had turned out to be long-lived. And there they are in the original Star Wars, and there they are in the new canon. Invisibility systems were not on all versions of armor. Shadow Troopers were one of the branches of the Galactic Empire's Special Operations Forces, worthy successors to the previously mentioned Shadow clones. Their tasks were reconnaissance, sabotage, liquidation or kidnapping of leaders of criminal groups and rebel movements, as well as all sorts of top-secret operations. Mostly they acted in the interests of the Imperial Intelligence Victorate. Rebels and Republicans, even Admiral Akbar, was seriously afraid of these mysterious soldiers. And there was something to be afraid of, especially knowing that about 9,000 of these select soldiers served under the command of one of the most secretive people of the Empire, Kronal, nicknamed Black Hole, aka Shadow Spawn. He had many names and was on the special list of the new Republican wanted list. The only time Shadow Troopers fought in the open, which is not typical for special forces, was the Battle of Minder, which took place 6 months after Endor. Despite the vast numerical superiority of the New Republic forces and the unfavorable disposition, the battle was nearly a disaster for the New Republic and the Mandalorians who had joined them, all because of Cranel's tricks and the professionalism of his soldiers. Especially memorable was the battle of 18,000 New Republic troopers, most of whom were left lying breathless carcasses on the inhospitable Mendor. Shadow Troopers appeared periodically throughout the Galactic Civil War. Operating as part of the Imperial Shard Special Forces, they would strike and hide in the shadows, hence the name Shadow Stormtroopers. But the Storm Commandos, while they too were often called upon for covert operations on behalf of intelligence and counterintelligence, more often still they operated for the army as part of an assault corps. Their armor was based on the armor of the Scout Stormtroopers, but with some interesting modifications. Firstly, the armor was covered with a rather rare and expensive replica steel polymer, which made the fighter almost impossible to detect by sensors and scanners. In addition, the armor was equipped with a noise reduction field, which allowed to fire a regular blaster almost silently and prevented the special forces from being detected by sound sensors. Add to this the superb training of the assault commandos and you have one of the best special forces in the galaxy of its time. In terms of combat skills, they even surpassed everyone's favorite clone commandos. And the skill of hiding, you won't find them. Rather, they will find you and kill you, or bring you to the right place for interrogation by the right person. But if a fighter was found and wounded, the commando could detonate a miniature explosive device to avoid capture. In the entire history of the Galactic Civil War, not a single Storm Commandos had ever been captured. Their armor cost 5,000 credits, compared to 2,000 for regular Stormtrooper armor. The Storm Commandos were the most effective special forces in the Galactic Empire, and their loyalty could not be questioned, even though their creator was none other than Crixus Medina, who later defected to the Rebel side and led the Rebel Commandos. After Endor, the trademark armor of Storm Commandos was apparently almost never produced. But the Imperial Special Forces and in the usual armor of Storm Scouts and even without armor could give heat. Here it will be appropriate to tell about the Scout Stormtroopers, Scout Troopers. Their protective gear was also a legacy of the Clone Wars, although outwardly they differed little from the Scout clones. The stuffing had changed very significantly. The visor helmet became noticeably smaller, but the fighter could only see better. First, there was a full-fledged built-in macro binoculars with good magnification, which in combination with the ability to record images and transmit them to the headquarters in real time was very useful. The built-in navigation system allowed the attackers not to lose concentration when moving at high speed over heavily rugged terrain on their extremely fast speeder bikes. For reference, the most common in Scout Group speeder bike 74Z from the company RT3 Repulsor Company developed a speed of up to 500 kilometers per hour on afterburner and cruising speed of 360 kilometers per hour. Although I would be afraid to accelerate up to 300 kilometers per hour on it for fear of flying out of the saddle. But don't worry about the dawn of the trooper. His ass was steady and firm in the saddle. Well, you remember how fast those white boys rode through the Endor forest, don't you? If not for the main character, they would have raced there without any problems, in the form of unplanned meetings with a face against a tree, and all thanks to high-quality navigation system in helmets, synchronized with the vehicle and corrected the route if necessary, up to prompting the driver of the safest turn. Previously, such a system was only in helmets bark clones, and now I believe enjoyed all scouts. With such a system can even on the move north-south on the anthill to determine. The second advantage is an improved system of aiming when shooting at long distances. Stormtrooper scouts not only did long and short-range reconnaissance, but were also known as excellent snipers. About the squirrel in the eye, I don't know, but here Rebel officers were knocked out with enviable regularity. By the way, a typical scout group consisted of 4 men, 2 of whom were armed with sniper rifles, sometimes blaster rifles, sometimes bullet rifles, and the other 2 were observers, spotters, providing cover. Though they could also take simple E11 blaster carbines on a mission in addition to their regular pistols. The third advantage of their armor was the ability to continue their work when their batteries were exhausted. Stormtrooper armor was highly dependent on batteries, on power cells. Scouts, on the other hand, could get along just fine without them. It was very important because sometimes scouting and sabotage missions lasted several weeks. If you ran out of charge, you could look through the visor like through an ordinary glass or raise the visor. The Scout clone helmets, as far as we could tell, didn't have a lifting visor yet. The batteries there rarely died, though. The influx behind his back was both a battery and a backpack. And in case of anything, you could recharge from your own speeder bike, carried by the battery. In general, the Scouts carried a lot of stuff on their bikes. Dry rations for a week or two, flares, a water purifier, a tent, a long-range comlink burner, a camouflage cape, and so on. In general, a good tourist's kit. And by the way, about camouflage capes and camouflage in general. In Episode 6, we were shown Scouts in traditional white armor, but it was not always and everywhere. Scouts, more often than other Stormtrooper specializations, painted their armor in protective colors. You can see an example in this picture. But the last advantage of the armor was its lightness and mobility. The 10-kilogram armor of regular Stormtroopers had no problems with mobility, but the Scout Stormtroopers wore super light armor that did not restrict their movements at all. For this, however, they had to pay with a 30% reduction in torso and head protection and a complete lack of thigh protection. When operating in cold climates, the Scout armor could be additionally equipped with reinforced heating means. And for hot climates, cooling was provided. In the new canon, another type of lightweight Stormtrooper armor shore troopers appeared. You saw them on Scarif in Outcast 1. These shore didn't do leather work unless you count skinning rebels and all other enemies of the Empire. Despite the word shore in their name, they were not coastal dwellers sunbathing on the sand and swimming in the warm sea. Though on Scarif they were mostly doing that, until the rabble roused them, a resort planet in fact. Short troopers are specialists in tropical warfare. Outwardly, the equipment had nothing in common with the usual armor of Stormtroopers, but their stuffing and functionality were roughly the same. What was different was the class of protection. It was lower, and the degree of mobility was better. Lack of leg protection to make it more fun to gallop through the jungle, and more flexible cuirass. That's about all the differences. There were very few short troopers in the Imperial forces, and the specialization turned out to be unnecessary since ordinary Stormtroopers did their job quite well. Even on Scarif, most of the local garrison wore the plain white armor of classic Stormtroopers. Ah yes, there was one other notable difference, the coloring of the armor. White, blue, and red stripes could be spotted on their armor. It was a return of the well-forgotten old, the colored stripes of the clones' quick rank recognition. For example, a blue cuirass with white stripes is a captain. Lieutenants had a blue stripe on the top of the cuirass and shoulder pads. What the red segment on the right wristband meant is still unknown, or I just haven't found it. It looks nice, but it's a big step backwards. But the rebel snipers say "thank you, family" to the Imperials. I can see who's the father commander and who to shoot at. And even if you don't know about colored stripes, shoot at the most colored one. The more a soldier looks like a parrot, the higher his rank. You can't go wrong. The equipment of the paramilitary guards was simple: a tank helmet, an infantry cuirass like soldiers of the Imperial Army, and that was it. In the movie, since the planet is cool, they were given magnetic boots. Well, really, what else can you call these shoes? Which allow you to walk on the train without fear that you will be blown away by the wind. The guards were obviously not hired for their merits, and they were supplied, as you can see, with whatever was left in the warehouse. Another fans of the wild combination of elements from different sets of armor in the new canon, this cave trooper. The breastplate and greaves were taken from a set of standard Stormtrooper armor. The helmet was taken from Scouts, adding a flashlight to it and adding to all this massive knee pads taken from Scouts. Tunnel fighters were very rare and did not gain much fame. In the movie about Solo on Nimbin, there are also Stormtroopers with an additional headplate. No, this is not specialized armor, but just trench work. As in reality, the farther away from the superiors, the more homemade and the more non-statutory the appearance. Although it was almost impossible to clean the armor in such mud. The reinforcement on the helmet appeared only because of the director's desire to add another visual element from the real world. as a kind of allusion to the trench nightmare of W.E. Similar removable armor plates were still on the German Stahlhelm M16 helmet, steel helmet, model of 16. From there, by the way, and these famous horns on German helmets. But the idea turned out to be so bad in reality. Additional 6mm steel armor plate could stop bullets, but the neck from such hello could say bye and break. Snipers, sappers, observers and stormtroopers were the first to receive such reinforcement, and then the rest got these helmets. Yes, by the way, the word Stormtrooper as the name of elite Imperial soldiers, Lucas did not take from the ceiling. It was stormtroopers called special units of the German army, designed to capture the forward trenches. And they also differed markedly from the rest of the soldiers' public by the presence of these unusual Kiras. However, closer to the end of the war, they were abandoned. If you speak German or find an English-language archive of the German press of 18 years, you will immediately notice how the German propaganda exalted the coolness of stormtroopers. Therefore, after the First World War, the paramilitary forces of the National Socialist German Workers' Party were called stormtroopers. There's another interesting reference in the equipment of stormtroopers. In the frame, a couple of times glimpses a fighter with homemade pouches, and this is a reference to American soldiers in Vietnam. As they say, find 10 differences. Back to the clones. Imperial snowtroopers had more comfortable helmets with an improved heating system, which could be worn for 24 hours without taking them off. The cuirass used was the same. The usual light infantry breastplate with additional heating, legs and arms were not protected at all. Such light equipment was chosen because it was extremely difficult to run up to your ears in the snow in heavy equipment, where your main enemy is the terrible, cold and hungry local fauna. The armor was supplemented by a cape and boots, also heated, and a thicker jumpsuit. Unlike ordinary stormtroopers, all snowmen had special backpacks, also inherited from the clones. They did not wear them only in short-term operations when the plan was to land, shoot for an hour or two, and run back to the base to warm themselves with warm tea or something stronger, while the bosses do not see. They carried an energy cell in their backpacks. Each snowtrooper had a stock of dry rations and emergency rations for 2 weeks. Every fourth stormtrooper carried a tent and mats, caramats. What the snowmen of all eras of Star Wars lacked was skis or some fantastic analog of them. More thorough protective equipment snowmen became only in the Masters of Winter Warfare from the First Order, although Masters is a bit of a mouthful. By the way, in the new canon, in the already twice mentioned Solo movie, we meet some more white comrades, the so-called patrol troopers, patrol soldiers. At that time, it was not yet known what they looked like, but now they are in the new canon. Patrol troopers wore light protective gear that saved them only from blaster pistols and low-powered cannons. But the helmet was more interesting. There was a navigation system and ease of control of the speeder at high speeds, borrowed from the Stormtrooper scouts. And the navigation system was synchronized with the city information network in real time. The patrols were formerly part of the Assault Corps, but they were not de facto stormtroopers. All the other soldiers looked at them with disdain. They had only shields, stun batons, and any non-lethal means of influencing the protesters. Other than that, it was just ordinary armor. The Imperials had the same thing, the same batons, shields of a different design, and the most ordinary armor. The First Order had pretty much the same thing, only the batons were smaller. But for whom it was necessary to compose a special armor with a huge number of modifications, it was the Imperial Jump Troopers, aka Rocket Troopers, aka Sky Troopers, aka Air Troopers. These are infantry with rocket jump packs, with special training and rare bravery. And to put it simply, they are men with a rocket on their backs. Clone troopers of this variety have been around as far back as the ancient Old Republic, where they had a reputation for suicide bombers. Although one of them, named Vokatara, even managed to become High Chancellor, or rather, he was lucky enough to live to become High Chancellor, as the death rate of the troopers was an order of magnitude higher than other military units. For over 1,000 years, the Republic has not had such a branch of the military as paratroopers. The Mandalorians invited by Jango Fett knew a lot about it. In fact, almost every second Mandalorian knew how to use a rocket pack. Realizing the value of troops for the Clone Wars, They revived jump troops, and in the Empire the tradition was continued, developed and deepened. In the new canon, jump troopers run in the usual armor stormtroopers, differing only reinforced helmet and crest, with a connected breathing system, and with a rocket pack itself. After all, a paratrooper is not a paratrooper without it. But in the original Star Wars, jump troopers had a completely different armor. Reinforced cuirass, more massive and durable shoulder pads. Even knee pads were a different shape. And one more difference, in the original Star Wars, troopers were considered to be one of the coolest stormtroopers in terms of combat training. Clones were not even close. But in the new canon, they were already the most ordinary stormtroopers, differing only in their ability to fly. Another species is the Novo Trooper. If you've never heard of them, don't feel bad. Most of the galaxy had never heard of them either, for they were special security units for only one planet, Naboo. These stormtroopers guarded historical and strategic sites on Naboo. Sometimes they protected the local aristocracy and were reinforcements for the local garrison, guarding ceremonial receptions, balls, honor guard during the Emperor's annual presentation of the highest state awards, which were traditionally held on Naboo, guarding ceremonial events on major state holidays such as Empire Day and New Year's holiday week. Quiet, boring, sleepy service was also on their task list. But there was no need to be deceived. They were trained better than the usual stormtroopers. They were guarding such important places after all, and their equipment differed only in the presence of a reinforced helmet and an additional armored plate on the belly. That's about it. They were simply enlisted into the shadow stormtroopers I've already told you about. You must have noticed the color of their armor, decorated with yellow stripes. Clone and stormtrooper armor was not always milky white, but sometimes there was camouflage, personal emblems and unit colors. Even Vader's Select 501 Legion for a long time wore armor with blue stripes in memory of the exploits of the Clone Wars. Usually the further away from the High Command, the more unique colors and personal emblems are found. Not to bore you with the details of the above, I can give you this example. Brezzik Ma, commander of Platoon 105 of the unnamed Stormtrooper Legion. He was stuck with his brain-dead subordinates on the Starlight Station orbiting the planet Septral 3. It's in the Addo system, in the Middle Ring, a boring, unpleasant, and extremely toxic planet whose atmosphere could corrode the hull of a spaceship in a few hours. The command has long forgotten about this garrison, and the superiors have forgotten about it. So the soldiers went into all sorts of mischief, drinking vodka, making disturbances, breaking discipline, hooliganism, tattoos, hair dyeing, and decorating their armor. Who can do what he likes? This one here had a Mandalorian symbol painted on his forehead. I hope the Mandalorians didn't know that. Brezzik Ma believed that individuality was the best way to bond a team. He was right about some things, of course. His soldiers were quite large despite their non-statutory appearance. The only people officially allowed to paint whatever they wanted on their armor were private armies and local armed forces if they could get permission to buy stormtrooper armor from the state. So if you go to any planet or system loyal to the Empire and you come across a stormtrooper wearing armor of blue, red, green, yellow, yes, even gray, brown, maroon or camouflage colors with some kind of crest or emblem, know that he may not be a stormtrooper. Even most likely he will not be a stormtrooper. For example, you might find such comrades in the elite guard and assault units of the noble houses of the Topani sector. It was not uncommon to find local modifications to the stormtrooper armor, and most importantly, it was legal. Sometimes the local aristocracy carried lightsabers as an analog of swords and waved them in duels. There was no point in banning anything from the Toponian aristocracy, since they loved the Empire so much. They love it so much that they have caught almost all the rebels in their sector, shot pirates, and they have almost no large organized crime as such. It's scary to rob there, you know. The example of the Yan terrorist group, which has long played on the nerves of the Imperials of many sectors, is worth mentioning. The Topanians caught the terrorists in their sector and handed them over to the Imperial authorities with a smile and good wishes, except that they were not wrapped in a brightly colored gift box and tied with a ribbon. The Empire had a banned terrorist group called Yan, Justice Action Network. When their leader was caught, a dozen Imperial governors nearly fought over who would execute him and how. Interesting fact, Normally, a guy or gal entering the Imperial State Military Academy would continue to serve in the Imperial military after graduation until they had served a minimum contract. But an exception was made for Topania. The noble houses often sent the most capable warriors from the Imperial Academy to obtain intelligent officers for the infantry and bodyguard guards. The noble houses of Topania were not the only ones allowed to purchase Stormtrooper armor. Still, it was a great rarity. Stormtroopers were the unofficial symbols of the Galactic Empire's military might, after all. They weren't allowed to buy such things left and right. And if they saw Stormtrooper armor on someone who wasn't a Stormtrooper, they were in trouble. Once upon a time, there was a muzzleloader known as Stormtrooper X who had a set of Stormtrooper armor, though he was mostly limited to just a helmet, and he was X for two reasons. One, his first and last name were unknown to anyone, and two, he had the letter X painted on his helmet. He had started out as a mercenary and smuggler in the service of the criminal mastermind Nabut-Je-Telite Priora. Having formed his own pirate Bantu, he not only robbed honest merchants but also did a disservice to his own boss by robbing his thieves' raspberry. Because of this, he was on the Imperial Criminal Investigation Service, and Khan Nabut had put a 20,000 credit bounty on his head. He was also being chased by Quan Jericho's own thugs. His most famous leaders were Zorbo, Gorgo, and of course Jumbo. X was either too brave or too stupid. Before Endoro, there were hardly any Sturmbroni in legitimate private possession. After Endoro, the Imperials themselves were in a mess with their gear. Supplies of gear became irregular, and some shards had no access to them at all. Back then, you defended your body with everything you could think of in various combinations. Some rulers like Singh went further. He did what Palpatine should have done: issued assault armor to infantrymen. Because he still had the factories to manufacture assault armor, he started his own guard, recruited stormtroopers who were loyal to him personally, called them Predators, and gave them advanced lightweight black and red armor that didn't restrict movement in any way. But they were quite sturdy. Singe was not stingy with his guardsmen's equipment. After Endor, a lot of armor began to appear on the black market. They were armor from old Imperial warehouses, armor found on the battlefields, and simply trophies. They had been there before, but with the start of the Imperial Civil War, they became very abundant. They were sold for 5,000, 6,000 credits in almost new condition. If they had a hole in them, you could get them cheaper. And in perfect condition with fully working electronics and communication system, they could be sold for 8,000. Let me remind you that the state armor was made for only 2,000, but that's what the black market is. In the post-Endor chaos, both in the expanded universe and in the new canon, you might see pirate fighters or mercenaries partially or fully clad in Stormtrooper armor. If there was no fully working armor, it was often limited to a cuirass. Some bounty hunters also enjoyed wearing Stormtrooper armor. Due to their superior manufacturing quality, the plastoid armor of the clones and Stormtroopers was in excellent condition, even decades after the final death of Emperor Palpatine. The only drawback to this armor was its conspicuousness. Such armor always attracts attention. The cowardly will be frightened and help to rob, but the soldiers of the Imperial Shards, at the sight of their armor on other people's shoulders, will immediately demand explanations and at best take away the fancy clothes, and at worst, you shouldn't show up in front of the New Republic Army soldiers wearing Stormtrooper armor either, because they would immediately frantically reach for their blasters and try to kill you. And, with a hole in the head, it's hard to explain to someone that the armor you just bought on the black market at a discount. Also, again in both new and old canon in post-Endor, there were groups of stormtroopers who decided to send the Galactic Civil War to a known location and go into mercenary work. They're professional military, well-trained, and in decent gear. The services of such guys were well valued. The New Republicans didn't trust them, of course, and the Imperials considered them traitors and dragged them to the tribunal at once. The former rebels, who became the New Republic, did not disdain the armor of stormtroopers either. After all, they were now only guerrillas and more often stormed the Shard's positions in the style of a classic all-arms offensive operation. And in such battles, armor is not superfluous, and sometimes even special forces wore the captured armor in full or in parts. To be fair, I'd like to point out that not only did they use trophy armor, but they had some pretty good armor of their own for assault units. especially when they went from being a rebel alliance to the New Republic. For example, you have the rebel version of Stormtroopers on screen right now. Their armor didn't protect the whole body, but their breastplates were more serious than the Imperial Stormtroopers. By the way, Cara Dune, played by the wonderful actress Gina Joy Carano in The Mandalorians, was just such a stormtrooper while serving in the Rebel Alliance. That's where her fondness for big, powerful guns comes from. Rebel stormtrooper armor cost 3 times as much as Imperial armor. 6,000 credits, almost like the super tricked out armor of a Katarn clone commando, price tag 6,500. By the way, on the black market, Kathan armor was incredibly rare, so it cost fabulous money, up to 100,000 credits. Both armor is not a panacea from death, but gives a good chance of survival. And while we're on the subject of armor effectiveness, how effective is Stormtrooper armor? Was it true that it could be pierced with a finger? Did it protect against blasters? Let's start with a quote from the novel Survivor's Quest. "Those were the last ones," one of the stormtroopers asked, pointing his blaster at the corpses. "As far as I know, yes," Luke replied, looking at him and the rest of the soldiers with concern and a certain admiration. All 4 of them had been in a mess. It was immediately apparent. The smooth and shiny armor of the stormtroopers was covered in blaster burns. 2 of the stormtroopers' breastplates were completely blackened. The armor of the other 2 showed at least a dozen points where the shots had burned through the armor. It was unclear how they were even still alive, let alone standing on their feet. Phil wasn't in the best shape either, though he was moving on his own. Luke noticed that Drask was staying close by to back him up in case of trouble. The time of the novel is the 22nd year after Yavin, after the end of the Galactic Civil War and the signing of the peace treaty of Pelion Gavrisum between the Imperial Shard and the New Republic. In this book, a small squad of stormtroopers from the 501st Legion of the Empire of the Hand dashingly gunned down dozens of mercenaries, killing at the same time their warlord, whose name remains unknown to us. Of course, here you can say that the mercenaries from the Legion of Wild Space did not penetrate the armor because they used old-model blasters with unknown gas that did not give a powerful plasma discharge. But this quote already breaks the myth about the uselessness of stormtrooper armor. The next fragment is from the story Fool's Bargain, where not only blasters were fired but also bullets flew. It's already clear from the cover art that the stormtrooper's armor could not be penetrated by either bullets or plasma. A quote, "6 armored mercenaries ran rumbling down the transverse corridor, nearly colliding with a ghost just around the corner. One of them shrieked in surprise, but they couldn't stop in time and ran straight into the center of the corridor intersection, stretching in a chain. They reached for their blasters to shoot the uninvited guests. The Guardian and the Ghost had already opened fire. The shots of their rifles hammered the shells of the 2 mercenaries standing at the edge. The low sound of his bullet weapons' bursts contrasted with the screech of the Imperial blasters. Only when the mercenary they were firing on staggered did Rascal realize that no one else was firing. The bullet weapons' shots hadn't penetrated their armor, but had caused them to stagger, preventing them from aiming. Unlike blasters, projectile weapons had a very significant impact. For half a second they were firing at the ceiling. That was enough for Ghost and the guards. They finished off their opponents and opened fire on the one Samuel had only unbalanced. However, here, as you can see, and the enemy had pretty good armor that could withstand the shot of bullet weapons. The stormtroopers were well aware that their armor gave them an advantage in battle, so there is a fragment further on. "Clear the room. Now we'll blow it up and tell them we'll go in first," Poot added as Samuel translated the guard's words to his soldiers. "There may still be heavy weapons in there, and we're the only ones in armor." You can find similar moments of stormtrooper survivability in newer novels. Here's a quote from the novel Twilight Company. This novel is already in the new canon. "She forced herself to remain calm. She told herself she would find a way to make things right. It was her duty as a stormtrooper, SP-475, and then the sniper opened fire. She remembered it clearly, because it was easier than thinking about the pain. The sniper's blaster shot had hit her right lung, melting some of her armor and jumpsuit with her skin. A medical evacuation team picked her up within minutes, transferring her to the garrison's emergency room. There she spent the early morning anxiously twitching, fearing death and pain as the droids cut the wound and injected Bacter and anesthetics. She cried and begged one of her comrades to stay with her, but no one would stay. This incident happened to a female stormtrooper serving in the 97th Legion, Tara Naenda, personal number SP-475. Small addition. Sniper weapons in Star Wars tend to be more powerful, and here she was also hit from a short distance, as there were simply no long distances between houses in this city. In the end, the shot pierced the armor, but the armor along with the jumpsuit contained the plasma, leaving only a burn on his chest. A light burn, I might add. After a few hours, Tara Naenda was able to walk, albeit with painkillers, and a couple days later she was discharged from the hospital. Incidentally, this was the second shot Tara caught that day. The previous shot had hit her in the head. The stormtrooper's helmet was as hard to penetrate as his cuirass. Before the encounter with the sniper, Tara's helmet had just been hit by such a blaster discharge on the outlier, breaking the battery. In the Clone Wars animated series, there was a similar incident where a sniper pair of commando droids fired a blaster discharge from a short distance straight into the chest of Captain Rex, personal number CT-7567. A man without armor would have been blown through and through along with the wall behind him. Rex was only slightly burned, and that evening he was already fighting off droids. The captain's treatment was limited to a Bacta patch. Please note that Rex was wearing Phase 1 armor, which was slightly inferior to Stormtrooper armor. And the instinct of self-preservation, the human instinct that is in any clone, does not want to let the body die. Here is an example of another officer of the Great Army who died a brave death in the battle for Nilad, captain or personal number unknown. He, along with his small squad and Jedi Commander General Aima Gandai, held off a droid attack in a canyon and survived a grenade blast almost under his feet, but survived, albeit briefly. A minute later, he would catch 2 direct hits to the chest from a short distance away and die along with his Jedi while surrounded by droids. And there are lots and lots of such examples of survivability. How is that possible? You ask that in the movie we see stormtroopers and clones falling from the first hit, falling and not giving any signs of life. And then we see them in hospital wards with blaster burns, but soon getting back into formation? There are 2 explanations. The first one is related to the lore and universe, and the second one is movie, cliché, Stormtrooper syndrome or Stormtrooper effect. First about the latter, or in case someone hasn't heard what a movie stamp in cinematography is. Stormtrooper effect is a cinematic or literary cliché that minor characters and unnamed enemies in Hollywood action movies, entertainment literature and comic books are inadequately weak in combat compared to the main characters. They die from even minor, light wounds inflicted by anything, despite their heavy armor. The term first appeared in movie critic Roger Ebert's Little Movie Glossary. The name of the term comes from the Imperial Stormtroopers from the classic movie trilogy who, despite shooting at close range, good weapons and good performance in combat, were completely unable to stand up to the main characters. One of whom, for example, Luke, had no combat training at all. Of course, this sort of thing was in Hollywood action movies and long before Star Wars, but George Lucas's universe became so popular and had such a colossal impact on popular culture that it was the Stormtroopers who became a household name. Flashback to the script for Episode 4. Another integral part of the Stormtrooper syndrome is the disproportionate severity of injuries from the same weapon received by different characters. While the bad guys, despite armor, health size, or training, die like flies from dichlorophos at any scratch, the protagonist always gets a light wound, characteristically usually in the arm or leg. Flash forward to the 6th episode already, and if suddenly the protagonist is still seriously wounded, the fact of injury becomes an important dramatic part of the narrative and is played up in every possible way to heighten the tension. And all to show the fury of the fight, as well as the determination of the protagonist. And here is a lore explanation of this phenomenon. Many sources repeat the same theses in different manners. Stormtrooper armor provides excellent protection against small, high-velocity grenade and artillery shell fragments, needle ammunition, bullets, and acid. Blaster rounds scatter across the armor at best, leaving only a black scorch on the surface with a bright mark in the center of the hit. In the X-Wing series of novels by Michael Stackpole and Aaron M. Alston, it is mentioned several times how difficult it is to kill a stormtrooper by shooting it with a pistol. Knocking him out, yes, you can, but killing or severely wounding him is already a problem. Civilian blaster weapons, concealed carry pistols, and civilian, including hunting blaster rifles, either could not penetrate the armor of a stormtrooper from the first hit, or did so with great difficulty and at close range. It is noted that an army blaster rifle at close range, or a particularly powerful blaster pistol, such as the DL-44, Han Solo's favorite gun, can penetrate the armor of a stormtrooper or clone on a direct hit. I emphasize direct hit. The stormtrooper's armor and the armor of the second phase clones can withstand shots that come at a tangent or at a decent distance when the blaster discharge has already weakened a bit. All this is explicitly stated not only in the extended universe sources but also in the so-called new canon. For example, read the latest edition of the All-Taming Star Wars guide out in late 2019, and as for the blaster, look at how powerful a weapon the blaster pistol is and what it can do to brickwork. Now imagine what the armor would have to be like to withstand such a hit. Of course, Han Solo had the gun's power turned almost to maximum, but that doesn't change the point. And if the armor is penetrated, it doesn't mean that the soldier is dead. Often there is a painful shock due to the high temperature of the blaster discharge plasma, and the person simply loses consciousness, as in those two examples with the girl Stormtrooper Tara Nienda and Captain Rex. They were knocked out for a while but ended up with only light burns. If you lose consciousness, you just lie there quietly for the rest of the battle while the others finish off the enemy. You'll wake up in a few hours. What if the armor wasn't there? Then it's a goner. A blaster is a serious thing. Something similar can be observed in the real world, and very often. When a bullet hitting an armored vest incapacitates a soldier, he may only have a broken rib. There are cases when the armor plate of the vest is penetrated. The bullet can get stuck in the lining without causing serious wounds. But even if the armor plate is penetrated, the lining and clothing too, it happens that the bullet barely goes deep into the body. And if there was no armor, get a long, lacerated wound channel with all the consequences that come out of you. And blood and guts will flow out. Body armor in the real world is not a panacea, but it increases the chances of survival. You can be easily wounded, concussed, get a fracture or other injury, lose consciousness, but you won't die. That's how it is in Star Wars with Stormtrooper armor. So it's better to suffer while lugging around a few extra pounds. How did the Ewoks kill the Stormtroopers? Very simple. They hit them in the joints of their armor, about the same way in the 15th, the 16th centuries fought with cotton waders, when the quality of cotton armor came to the point where it became extremely difficult to penetrate it with a sword, axe, or even a halberd with a rump. Official illustration for the novel Choices of One. Mara Jade presents the Stormtrooper heroes to Vader. Notice all of them have blaster hits on their armor. Some are lightly wounded. If they weren't wearing armor, they'd all be deader than dead. Or here's another official drawing of Mara Jade and a Stormtrooper. The Emperor's hand is treating a severely wounded soldier with force. Despite the huge hole in his cuirass, the soldier is still alive. The girl Stormtrooper Tara Nienda suffered roughly the same injury in the snippet quoted above. And here's a medic helping a wounded comrade who was hit in the chest by a droid shot. As you can see, he's alive. In the following official artwork, you see one Stormtrooper having taken at least 2 hits, the trail of one of which is still smoking, continues the fight, but his comrade is already down wounded or killed. Well, and in conclusion, the cover of the 16th issue of the Empire comic book series, To the Last Man. Everything from arrows and spears to blaster shots flew at the Stormtroopers, and although most of the Stormtroopers' squads died in that battle, they killed many thousands of Xeno's natives. Well, one last thing regarding armor durability. In the real world, there are different classes of body armor. Star Wars also has its own classes of protection: light armor, medium armor, heavy armor, and then there is power armor. Stormtrooper armor having the level of protection of medium armor on the level of mobility and ease of wearing passed as light, which is already a lot. And most of the medium armor, that is armor higher in class, available on the galactic arms market to all comers, did not have such a good electronic stuffing, especially for such money. No wonder why clone and Stormtrooper armor was so respected, so popular. What was supposed to be Phase 3 clone armor and became known as Stormtrooper armor was so successful that it remained almost unchanged for decades. But there is no limit to perfection. Somewhere between 45 and 130 years after Yavin, that is in the Legacy era, already after the Second Galactic Civil War, The armor of stormtroopers was strengthened, learning to more or less disperse and absorb even direct hits from modern army blaster rifles. The armor of sergeants and junior officers once again bore the colored stripes of rapid cognition, as they had at the beginning of the Clone Wars. Well, and perhaps most importantly, since the revived Galactic Empire under the rule of the Emperor of the Fallow dynasty began to willingly accept everyone for service, including the Assault Corps, it was necessary to adapt the armor for representatives of different races, because of which this picture became familiar. Imagine how many need to create helmets, cuirasses, greaves armor and gloves, not only for different body sizes, but also for different races. It's a supply chain nightmare. But the politics of diversity and equality demanded such sacrifices. The First Order Stormtrooper's armor had departed from his imperial ancestor. It was different for the worse. Despite some of its own industry and active monetary support from sympathizers from the New Republic, the First Order had little money and resources. They had to simplify the armor. In Episode 7, a Stormtrooper plumber said that Stormtrooper helmets couldn't filter toxins. Imperial Stormtrooper helmets can, First Order helmets can't. The filters and the whole life support system back then were rudimentary, capable of protecting a soldier only from smoke. The guidance system got worse, and the optics, the macro-binocular effect. Forget it was ever there. If you want to see something in the distance, take binoculars, which, by the way, were only for sergeants and officers. Let me remind you, a stormtrooper could zoom in. The magnification we don't know exactly, but probably from 4 to 8. The First Order also had problems with access to a quality material that was both strong and light. In the First Order, the snowmen, snow cadavers, were the most fortunate ones. They finally received full armor instead of a simple cuirass and helmet. New armor received and combat swimmers, but what was their armor is still, alas, is not known. To be more precise, it has not yet been invented, not described in reference books and not told in books. The same applies to the armor of flamethrowers and paratroopers with rocket packs. Whether the First Order had access to polymer is still unknown. Perhaps they did. Or the armor of the First Order's elite soldiers was painted black just for beauty's sake. In defense of stormtroopers, I want to say only one thing. Personally, I'm not embarrassed by their appearance. I even like it. Firstly, they immediately guess familiar features of the armor. You can feel the connection with the classic movie trilogy. And secondly, they look quite modern. That's all for today. Do not forget to wear protective gear. Shoot accurately and faithfully serve the state you swore an oath to.